The grave of the wrong husband. Grief doesn't arrive like thunder. It arrives like a small, practical inconvenience that never leaves. A closet you can't open without smelling his cologne in the coats. A coffee mug you keep washing even though nobody drinks from it anymore. The quiet click of the thermostat at night, reminding you the house is still alive even when you feel like you aren't. I learned that after Noah died, in the first few weeks, everyone tells you the same phrases. He's in a better place. Time heals. Be strong. But the truth is, time doesn't heal. It reorganizes. It turns a person into a map of missing things. My name is Marinellery, and my husband was cremated on a Tuesday morning under a sky that couldn't decide whether it wanted to rain or forgive us. The chapel was too bright. The flowers looked too healthy. People spoke in soft voices like they were trying not to startle death into returning. I signed forms with hands that didn't feel attached to my body. The funeral director, a man with a name tag that said J. Caro, slid papers across a polished desk. He spoke in careful, practiced phrases, explaining process and handling and final arrangements, as if the right vocabulary could make the universe less cruel. Noah's urn was delivered 3 days later. It arrived in a cardboard box, sealed with tape. I remember thinking, stupidly, this is how a life comes home now? In shipping, I set the urn on the mantel beside a framed photograph of us at the coast. Noah squinting into sunlight, my hair whipped by wind, both of us smiling the way people smile when they still believe in continuity. I waited for the house to feel different, for the air to carry something holy, for silence to become peaceful. But the house didn't feel widowed. It felt occupied. That's the first strange thing I noticed. And it's the detail I keep circling back to even now. Not cold spots, not knocking, not ghostly whispers, just the subtle sensation that the rooms were no longer mine alone. It began with small moments that didn't seem worth naming. A faint pressure in the hallway, like walking past someone standing too close. The impression that the guest room door was slightly more open than I remembered. A smell that didn't belong damp soil. Faintly metallic, like wet pennies. I dismissed it as grief. Grief changes your senses. It makes your own house unfamiliar. It makes you second-guess the position of every object, as if sorrow has bumped into your life and rearranged it while you slept. But then came the first night I heard footsteps. Not upstairs, not outside. In my bedroom. The house was quiet in that deep way it gets after 2 a.m., when even the refrigerator stops humming as if it's listening too. Rain tapped gently at the windows. The street lamp outside cast a pale rectangle of light across the floorboards. I woke because something shifted the air near my bed. Not a draft, not wind, the air displacement of movement. I lay very still, heart catching in my throat. Then I heard it again, a soft scuff across wood. Bare feet, dragging lightly, not running, not sneaking, a sound with the casual entitlement of someone walking in their own home. I didn't turn on the lamp. I don't know why, except that fear makes cowards of sensible people. It persuades you that if you don't make a sound, the universe won't notice you. The footsteps circled the bed once, slow, deliberate, then stopped. Silence pressed down. I stared into the dimness and tried to shape shadows into furniture. The dresser, the chair, the edge of the closet door. Then the street lamp light flickered slightly, and in that faint shift, I saw a figure, not at the foot of the bed, not in a doorway, right beside me, close enough that if I reached out, my hand would meet cloth. The figure was a man, but not my husband. Noah had been broad-shouldered, neat in his movements, the kind of man who always smelled faintly of clean soap and winter air. This man was thin, hunched, dressed in something that looked like torn funeral clothes. His hair lay in greasy ropes against his forehead. His skin had a grayish sheen, like someone who'd lived too long in damp underground darkness. And he was smiling, not a polite smile, a grin so self-satisfied it made my stomach turn. His eyes met mine, and I realized with a cold jolt that he knew I was awake. The man raised his arms slowly like a performer on stage and began to move. He danced, not beautifully, not gracefully. He shuffled his feet in a grotesque little rhythm, shoulders twitching, arms jerking in sloppy circles, like mockery. dramatic celebration, a victory dance done by something that felt wrong. I couldn't breathe. The bed sheets clung to my legs like restraints. The man danced around the bed, circling it the way the footsteps had circled, round and round. His grin never faded. Then he leaned close to me, close enough that I smelled a mirth, damp cloth, smoke, something stale like old breath trapped inside a box. And though his lips moved, no sound came out. His mouth shaped words I couldn't hear, but I understood them anyway, because grief teaches you to translate silence into meaning. Mine. That was what his smile said. Mine now. I squeezed my eyes shut, and in that moment of panic I forced my hand toward the lamp. My fingers shook so hard I nearly missed the switch. Light exploded into the room. The air snapped back into normal. No man, no dancing, no damp smell. Just my bedroom. Too bright, too empty, too ordinary. But the sheets were tangled like someone had paced over them. And on the floor beside the bed, a footprint. A single bare footprint made of ash-gray dust. I didn't sleep again that night. I sat on the edge of the bed with the lamp on and watched the walls as if they might breathe. My rational mind tried to rebuild reality from scraps. A dream. A grief hallucination. But the footprint remained. In the morning light, it looked even more impossible. Ash, like cremation ash. I knelt and touched it with my fingertip. The dust smudged, fine and dry. I stared at it until my eyes hurt. Then I turned slowly toward the mantel in the living room, toward the urn. The house was quiet, but I swear, absolutely swear, I felt something in the air shift when I looked at it. Not paranormal, not cinematic, just possessive, like an object being watched by someone who believes it belongs to him. That afternoon, I did something I'd never thought I would do. I booked an appointment with a medium, not because I believed in mediums, because I needed my grief to become structured. I needed a conversation with death, even if I had to pay someone to pretend it was possible. The medium's name was Claudine Marr, and her office was above a crystal shop on the edge of Lantern Row, the kind of place that always smells like incense and old velvet. She had soft eyes and careful hands. She listened to my story without laughing. That alone almost made me cry. Then she asked me a question that made my throat tighten. "Do you trust the ashes?" she said gently. I blinked. "What do you mean?" Claudine's fingers tapped once against the table. "Do you trust they gave you the right person?" she asked. The question landed like a stone in my stomach, because I realized I'd never considered it. I'd signed papers. I'd received a box. I'd placed an urn on my mantel. In grief, you accept procedure as truth. But what if procedure can be wrong? That night, Claudine asked me to bring the urn. She placed it on a cloth on her table like it was a fragile animal. She lit a single candle. The flame was steady, too steady. Then she took my hands and told me to speak Noah's name. I did. My voice cracked. The air in the room felt heavier, as if someone had closed an invisible door. Claudine's eyes rolled back slightly, not dramatically, but like she was listening inward. Her lips parted. Then she froze. A long, terrible stillness. When her eyes opened again, they were wide with fear. "That's not him," she whispered. My heart slammed. "What?" I said. "That's not your husband," Claudine repeated, voice shaking now. "Whatever's attached to those ashes, it's not Noah." The candle flame flickered violently. The room went colder. Claudine stared at the urn like it had begun to breathe. Then she raised her hand slowly and pointed not at me, not at the candle, not at the window, at the urn, and in a voice that sounded like it came from somewhere older than her throat, she said, "He's already moved into the house." But no, after Claudine whispered that it wasn't him, I carried the urn home the way you carry a sleeping infant, close, careful, terrified of waking whatever rests inside, yet I could feel, even through porcelain and cloth, that the weight in my arms was not passive. It had a presence that pressed back against my palms like a stubborn hand refusing to be moved. And the drive through Port Meridian felt wrong in that quiet late-night way. Streetlights, smearing pale gold across wet asphalt, red brake lights bleeding into puddles. Every stoplight holding me too long, as if the city itself wanted me to sit with the decision of whether to turn back. And when I arrived at the house on Juniper Hollow Lane, the porch light flickered once before steadying, a small electrical hiccup that should have meant nothing. Except everything meant something now. And the second I stepped inside, I smelled it again, the damp, metallic soil scent, the wet pennies smell that had no right to live in a clean suburban home. And my stomach tightened because it felt like entering a room where someone had been waiting for you in the dark and was now pleased you finally arrived. And I set the urn on the mantel with shaking hands and stood there too long, staring at it as if it might shift, as if it might turn its invisible attention toward me. And in the silence, my thoughts began racing in circles. Funeral services can make mistakes, paperwork can be swapped, labels can be misread, people can be careless. But the medium's reaction had not been the cautious skepticism of a professional entertainer. It had been fear, raw and involuntary. And fear does not come from paperwork. It comes from recognition. And that meant the ashes held a personality, a will, a wrongness that didn't belong to a harmless clerical error. So I did what grieving people do. When dread becomes unbearable, I sought something I could do, a task with steps and proof, because action is the closest thing to sanity. And the next morning I drove straight to Caro and Sons Memorial, the funeral home that had handled Noah's cremation. A neat building with trimmed hedges and soft instrumental music drifting in the lobby like a lie. And I told myself I was there for clarification, for a simple confirmation of chain of custody. Yet my hands were cold and my jaw ached from clenching. And when I asked the receptionist for Mr. Caro, her smile tightened in that way service workers tighten when they sense trouble, and she disappeared behind a door and returned with the same funeral director who had slid forms across the desk on that too bright Tuesday, his suit as crisp as ever, his hair combed as if grief were something he could keep neat. And he greeted me with practiced sympathy, calling me Mrs. Ellery, asking softly how I was holding up. And for a moment, I almost hated him for how smoothly he could speak about death, because smoothness felt like guilt. So I cut through the pleasantries and asked for documentation, exact times, signatures, tags, identification numbers, everything that proved the urn on my mantel belonged to my husband. And Mr. Caro's expression barely changed, but his blink was a fraction slower than it should have been. And that tiny delay made my throat tighten, because delays are where lies breathe. And he told me mistakes were extremely rare, that their process was meticulous, that every cremation was tracked, that I could trust them. And then he said something that sounded kind but landed like a warning. Mrs. Ellery, revisiting these details can deepen your grief, as if grief were the danger and not the possibility that a stranger's remains sat in my living room. And I insisted anyway, voice sharper than I meant, and he finally printed documents and laid them out on the same polished desk, pointing to barcodes and dates, explaining the cremation took place in their affiliated facility called Hearthstone Crematory, explaining ashes were sealed and labeled, explaining the urn was prepared with a matching tag. And while he talked, I stared at the printed lines like an investigator rather than a widow, scanning for anything that didn't fit. And there, near the bottom, was a number, handwritten in pen, quick addition beside Noah's name, and my skin went cold as I asked what it was. And Mr. Caro said calmly it was an internal correction, a reassignment code from their facility that morning due to equipment scheduling. And I heard those words, equipment scheduling, like I was supposed to accept them as normal. Yet something about them made my stomach twist, because death should not be scheduled like laundry. And I asked to see the original cremation tag, the physical label used that day, and he told me politely that it had already been archived, and the politeness in his refusal was the final nail, because politeness is a door that won't open. So I did something I'm not proud of. I lied, telling him I needed it for a legal matter, an insurance dispute, and at the word legal, his expression changed in the smallest possible way. The same change you see when someone mentally counts how much trouble a problem might cost them. And he promised to look into it, and I left with copies of documents that proved nothing except that a system had produced paperwork. And as I walked through the lobby, I felt an awful sensation that the place itself was watching me, not in the supernatural way, but in the human way of institutions protecting themselves. And on my drive home, the rain began again in thin needles, and every street sign looked like an accusation. And at home, the house greeted me with that damp soil smell, as if mocking the fact that I'd tried to solve the problem with offices and printers. And the first truly unbearable escalation happened that night, not at 3:15, but earlier, at 11:40 p.m., while I stood in the kitchen rinsing a mug. when I heard the soft squeak of floorboards in the hallway, bare feet, dragging. The same confident scuff, and I froze with my hands in warm water, listening, and then I heard it again. Closer, and I turned slowly and saw, in the dark reflection of the microwave door, a shape moving behind me. A thin man hunched slightly, shoulders jerking as if warming up for a dance, and though he was not fully visible, I could see the outline of ragged clothing and the wrong angle of his grin. And when I whipped around, the hallway was empty, but the smell remained strong enough to make my eyes water, and my hands shook so hard the mug slipped and shattered in the sink. And that sound, ceramic breaking, felt like the first true crack in my safe domestic life, because it proved the haunting wasn't confined to dreams or bedrooms. It was wandering freely now, practicing ownership. And I did the only thing I could think to do. I gathered every lamp in the house into the living room, turned them all on until the space looked like an overexposed photograph, and I sat on the couch staring at the mantel, at the urn, waiting for it to do something, daring it to explain itself. And sometime after midnight I heard the slow creak of the closet door in the bedroom, Noah's closet, and the sound was so intimate it made my chest feel bruised, because closets are private. Closets are where you keep someone's smell. And I stood, with my heart racing, and walked down the hallway, and pushed open the bedroom door, and there, in the dim glow from the living room lamps, I saw the closet hanging open, and Noah's favorite coat, his heavy winter coat, was not hanging neatly where I'd left it. It was draped over the chair in the corner as if someone had worn it and tossed it off carelessly, and for a moment, grief surged up in me, because the coat on the chair looked like Noah returning home. But the illusion died instantly when I smelled the damp soil odor clinging to the fabric, a smell Noah never carried, and I felt nausea rise as I realized the stranger had touched my husband's things like a child rummaging through someone else's toys, and as I stepped closer to the chair, the coat's sleeve shifted slightly, not falling, not sliding, but lifting the tiniest amount as if an invisible hand were still inside it, and I stumbled backward and fled to the living room and grabbed the urn and pressed it hard against my chest, shaking, whispering Noah's name like it might summon him to defend me. But the urn stayed silent, heavy, unresponsive, and that silence made me understand the cruelest part of the mistake. If Noah's ashes were not here, then Noah could not be anchored here. And if the wrong man's ashes were here, then the wrong man had the anchor, the claim, the foothold, and I couldn't sleep. I couldn't eat. I could only count hours until morning, and at 6:20 a.m., I drove back to Hearthstone Crematory without calling first, because appointment etiquette felt irrelevant when someone was dancing in your hallway at night, and the crematory sat on the edge of industrial Port Meridian, surrounded by chain link and shipping warehouses, the air smelling faintly of exhaust and salt. And when I demanded to speak to the manager, a tired woman with thinning hair met me in a small office where the walls were lined with framed certificates that looked like apologies, and I laid my documents on her desk, my voice shaking, and demanded she tell me the truth about the reassignment code. And she stared at the paper for a long time, then looked up at me with a guarded expression and said, very softly, that they had had an incident that morning. A mislabeled tray, a temporary mix-up, quickly corrected. And the way she used the word corrected made my skin go cold because it implied the original wrongness was real, and I demanded to know whose ashes were in my urn. And she hesitated long enough for my heart to sink, then said she couldn't disclose other families' information. And in that moment I realized the system would protect itself first, even if it meant leaving a stranger haunting my house. And I began to shake with rage and grief, and I told her I didn't care about policies. I cared about the fact that someone who was not my husband was coming into my bedroom at night. And the manager's eyes widened, and for a second, her professional mask slipped, revealing genuine fear. And she whispered, almost as if she were afraid the building might overhear, sometimes families complain about things. And when I demanded what she meant, she swallowed and said there had been other reports, rare ones, about restlessness, when remains were misassigned, and the phrase sounded insane in her mouth. Yet, she said it like a person repeating a rumor that refuses to die. And she told me their policy was to offer re-verification, to check records, to cross-reference tags. And then finally she offered the one detail that made my blood freeze. The wrong ashes they'd accidentally swapped in that morning belonged to a man who had been unclaimed for years. A man with no close family. A drifter found dead near the waterfront. Identity uncertain. Cremated under a temporary placeholder name. And when she said drifter, I saw the dancing figure's ragged clothes in my mind, the damp soil smell, the grin of entitlement. And I understood the haunted logic instantly. If he had no family, no name, no home, then any home would do. Any body of ashes would do. Any widow's house with a warm bed would feel like opportunity, and I drove home with my hands shaking on the steering wheel. And when I opened my front door, the house smelled stronger than ever, and on the living room rug, leading from the mantel toward the hallway, I saw a trail of ash-gray footprints, small, bare, smug like someone had paced around while I was gone, practicing the rooms, learning the route to my bedroom. And in the center of the footprints, pressed into the carpet fibers, was one distinct pattern I hadn't seen before. A half-circle scuff, repeated twice, like the beginning step of a dance. That trail of ash-gray footprints on my living room rug didn't frighten me the way a ghost story is supposed to frighten you. It didn't make my skin prickle with the theatrical thrill of the unknown. It made my stomach turn with something much more intimate and humiliating violation because the prints weren't random. They weren't the wandering marks of a lost spirit. They were practice steps, deliberate turns and half-circle scuffs that spoke the language of a person getting comfortable. And the most unbearable part was that they began at the mantel, at the urn, as if he had walked out from his own container like a man leaving a hotel room, and ended at my hallway, at the private artery that led to my bedroom, and I stood there with my coat still on and my keys trembling in my hand, staring at those marks and realizing the house no longer belonged to grief. It belonged to claim, and something inside me snapped from fear into fury, because if the system wouldn't fix this, if the crematory hid behind policy and paperwork, then I had to protect my home the way widows protected homes long before people had customer service lines. So I vacuumed the prints until the machine whined like an animal. I scrubbed the carpet with hot water and detergent until my knuckles went raw. I sprinkled salt across thresholds, even though I didn't believe in salt, not really. But belief becomes irrelevant when you are cornered. And then I gathered Noah's things, the winter coat, his shoes, his scarf, the sweater that still smelled faintly of him, and I sealed them into plastic bins like evidence, because I understood the stranger wasn't drawn to me by love. He was drawn to ownership, to objects, to whatever made a house feel inhabited, and if I stripped the house of Noah, maybe the stranger would lose his root, maybe the anchor would loosen. Yet even while I worked, the air felt busy, the floorboards clicking softly in rooms I wasn't in as if someone walked just out of sight. And at 9:40 p.m., when the sun had fully vanished and the windows turned black mirrors, I sat in my overlit living room with every lamp blazing, clutching my phone like it was a weapon, and the house responded by becoming louder in its quiet way, the pipes ticking, the ceiling settling, and then worse than any sound came the smell again. Damp soil and smoke, blooming from the hallway like breath exhaled from behind a door. And the first visible sign of him that night came not as a full-bodied apparition, but as movement in fabric, because the curtain near the hallway stirred slightly, not from wind, not from the HVAC, but from something brushing past it, and the hairs on my arms rose as if my skin knew before my mind did, and I forced myself to stand and walk toward the hallway with my heart hammering, telling myself I was not a helpless woman in a haunted house. I was an adult in a suburban home with a mortgage and locks. And if something tried to intimidate me, I would treat it like an intruder. But the hallway felt colder the deeper I stepped. Not ghost cold, not supernatural, chill, but the stale cold of places that don't get sunlight. And halfway down I saw a detail that made my throat close. The framed wedding photo on the wall. Noah and me smiling in late afternoon light had been turned slightly, angled outward as if someone had touched it, and the glass was smeared with a grayish fingerprint that looked like ash mixed with moisture. And my knees weakened because touching a photo is personal. It's the kind of thing only family does, only someone who believes they belong. And I wiped the smear with the sleeve of my sweater, and the ash left a faint streak like charcoal. And then I heard the faintest sound behind me, a soft scuff on wood, and I spun and saw him at the far end of the living room, standing in the darker patch between lamplight pools, thin and hunched and very real looking, wearing ragged clothes that hung too loose as if they'd been stripped from another body, and he smiled at me with that same triumphant grin, as if we were finally being introduced properly. And though his mouth moved again, I heard no voice, only the silence of him, the unbearable confidence of someone who doesn't need permission to speak. And he began to sway, one shoulder lifting, one foot sliding. Not a full dance yet, but the start of it. The same half-circle scuff I'd seen in ash prints. And in that moment, I realized the dancing wasn't random madness. It was ritual, a claiming performance, like a man whistling while changing the locks, and my hand shook so violently I almost dropped my phone. But I lifted it anyway and began recording, not because I thought a video could protect me from a dead man, but because evidence is the only language institutions respect, and as the camera aimed at him, the screen showed what my eyes saw dim, grainy, a pale figure in shadow, and for a moment, I felt relief because it meant I wasn't hallucinating. It meant he was real enough to be captured, but that relief died instantly when the figure on my screen turned slightly, as if noticing the lens, and the grin deepened in a way that made my stomach lurch, and then the camera image distorted, pixels crawling like ants across the screen, the figure smearing into black and gray blocks, and my phone shut itself off with a sharp click as if a hand had slapped it closed. And the silence that followed felt louder than any scream, and he stepped closer in my living room, one sliding foot at a time, slow, confident, and I backed away, whispering Noah's name like a prayer, even though I knew it was useless. And the stranger lifted a hand, palm up, fingers slightly curled, and the gesture was obscene in its meaning. Invitation, entitlement, come here. And my fear hardened into disgust, because I understood then what he wanted wasn't simply the house. It was the last thing in the house that remained warm and alive. And I ran, not upstairs, not into bedrooms where corners trap you, but into the kitchen where drawers hold knives. And I yanked one out with shaking hands and returned to the living room holding it out like an idiot, because how do you threaten a thing that doesn't breathe? But I needed the gesture. I needed my body to feel active. And he stopped, watching the knife like it amused him. And then he did something that made my blood freeze. He leaned his head slightly to the side the way Noah used to when he was trying to understand me, mimicking intimacy, stealing familiarity. And the grin softened into something that looked like affection. And that was when the house itself betrayed me, because the living room lamps flickered once, twice, then dimmed, as if someone had lowered them deliberately. And in that dimness, the stranger's features became clearer. The grime on his skin, the dark crescents under his eyes, the ash in his hair, and the smell grew stronger, the scent of someone dug from wet earth, and he began to dance again. This time fully, circling the coffee table like a stage, stepping in deliberate loops as if tracing ownership over the floor plan. And as he danced, objects in the room shifted subtly in his wake, picture frames quivering, a book on the shelf tilting, the mantel clock stuttering as if time itself didn't like his rhythm. And then he raised one arm and pointed not at me, at the mantel, at the urn, and I felt a sudden pressure in my ears like altitude change, and the urn's lid gave the faintest click, not opening, just loosening, as if something inside had turned. And terror hit me so hard my vision blurred, because I realized the ashes weren't inert. The ashes were a hinge, and if that hinge opened wider, whatever he was could become more solid, more permanent. And I rushed forward and grabbed the urn, clutching it like a shield, and the stranger paused mid-step, grin sharpening, and in the dimness, he lifted his hand slowly like a man who was both surrendering and welcoming. And I heard, finally, the faintest sound from him, not a word, not a whisper, but a soft, wet chuckle, like breath moving through dirt, and the sound made me want to vomit because it proved he could make noise when he chose. And the moment that sound entered the room, the bedroom door upstairs creaked open by itself. A long, slow groan of hinges, like the house offering him access, and I stood shaking with the urn against my chest. A knife forgotten, and understood the escalating truth. He didn't need to overpower me. He only needed to normalize himself in my space until the space cooperated, until doors opened for him, until my own routines became his routines. And that night I didn't sleep at all. I sat in the living room with the urn in my lap, lamps blazing again, and when dawn finally smeared gray light across the windows, I found one last ash print on the kitchen tile near the back door, and beside it, written faintly as if traced with a wet fingertip in ash and condensation, was a single word I couldn't misread even if I tried. Mine. By the time the ash wrote mine on my kitchen tile, my fear had curdled into something colder than panic, because panic is still hopeful in a way. It still believes escape is possible, whereas what I felt that morning was the sick understanding that the stranger wasn't merely visiting my house. He was revising it, rewriting the rules of belonging room by room, step by step, until the house itself started acting like it recognized him, and that kind of intrusion isn't fought with lamps and knives. It's fought with corrections. So I called Hearthstone Crematory again and refused to be polite. I refused to be the kind, grieving customer they could soothe and dismiss. I demanded a supervisor, a director, a legal representative, anyone with authority and fear of paperwork. And when they tried to reroute me through sympathy, I said I would go to the press, I would go to the city, I would go to the licensing board, I would post the documents and names and reassignment code online. And the only reason those threats worked is because the dead can haunt you, but reputation can haunt them. And within hours, a man from Hearthstone, Mr. Denslow, arrived at my door in a gray coat with a clipboard, smelling of office air and stale coffee. And he looked like someone who had never believed in ghosts in his life, which would have comforted me if the air behind him hadn't already begun to smell faintly of damp soil the moment he stepped inside. And I didn't waste time. I showed him the ash print. I showed him the smear on the wedding photo. I told him about the footsteps and the dance, and he listened with that strained professional patience people use when they're deciding whether you're delusional or dangerous to their company. And then I lifted my phone and played him the only evidence I'd managed to keep a short clip from the previous night before the distortion. Only seconds long, but long enough to show a pale, hunched figure in my living room. Grainy, yes, but undeniably present. And I watched Mr. Denslow's face as he stared at the footage, watched his skepticism wobble into discomfort, and for the first time since Noah died, I felt a flicker of victory, because disbelief is armor until it cracks. And once it cracks, people start taking you seriously. And Mr. Denslow cleared his throat and admitted that an internal swap had occurred on the day of cremation, that a drifter labeled under a placeholder ID had been mistakenly matched to Noah's urn code for less than an hour, that the facility had corrected it before release. But that paperwork showed a discrepancy because the correction happened after a barcode scan. And he said it in that same sterile tone people use when talking about inventory. But his hands trembled slightly as he spoke, because he wasn't thinking about barcodes anymore. He was thinking about the shape in my living room footage, and I demanded he fix it. Not later, not through review, now. And he hesitated. Hesitated long enough for the house to grow colder, and then he said the only thing he could do. They would offer an immediate re-verification and exchange, retrieving Noah's ashes from their secure holding and replacing what I had. And part of me wanted to scream at the absurdity of it, the idea that the solution to a haunting was a customer service correction. But another part of me, desperate, practical, clung to it. Because if the ashes were the anchor, then the anchor had to move. So we arranged it like a transaction. A terrible, sacred transaction. Mr. Denslow insisted on escorting me to Hearthstone himself, insisting the urn remain sealed, insisting we bring it in as is for a chain of custody swap. And I agreed, even though the moment he said chain of custody, the house groaned faintly as if disapproving. And as I carried the urn out to my car, I felt the weight shift. Not physically, but in presence, as if something inside was pressing itself to the porcelain walls, listening. And on the drive to the crematory, the clouds hung low and dirty over Port Meridian, the kind of sky that makes everything feel like it's already been smoked and cooled. And I kept glancing at the urn in the passenger seat, half expecting it to tip itself or click open, but it sat still like a patient animal. And when we arrived at Hearthstone, the building's industrial plainness felt obscene. Because how could something this banal manage the border between bodies and afterlives? How could fluorescent lights and linoleum floors hold the power to swap souls? And Mr. Denslow led me past a security door into a back corridor where the air was warmer, drier, smelling faintly of ash and disinfectant, and my skin prickled as if my body recognized the scent as dangerous. And he brought me into a small room with stainless steel tables and shelves of identical containers labeled in neat black print. And in that room, the quiet was different. Not house quiet, but facility quiet. The quiet of something that has seen too many endings to bother whispering. And Mr. Denslow told me to set the urn on the table. Then he stepped away and returned with another urn, simpler, plain, labeled with Noah's full name and my signature line from the original paperwork, and the sight hit me with such sudden grief that my eyes stung, because I realized I'd never truly believed I could get him back in any form. And now there was this heavy little vessel that might actually be him, might be the correct remainder of the man I loved, and my hands shook as I reached toward it. But before I could touch it, the room's fluorescent lights flickered once, not like a normal power wobble, but like a blink, and the temperature dropped sharply enough that my breath fogged in a place it shouldn't, and the damp soil smell arrived as if someone had opened a wet grave right beside us. And Mr. Denslow went pale and swallowed hard. And in that moment I understood with cold clarity that the stranger had followed, not through streets or doors, but through ownership, through attachment, through the right to be near his own ashes. And as if to prove it, the sealed urn on the table gave a soft click from inside one small internal knock, then another, and my stomach rolled as the lid shifted a millimeter, and Mr. Denslow whispered a curse under his breath, then fumbled with latex gloves like a man trying to put armor on his hands, and he told me they would perform the swap immediately, now, before anything else occurred, and he began unsealing paperwork, scanning barcodes, his hands moving too fast. And I watched the urn lid shift again as if something inside were pushing upward with slow insistence, and I felt my fear spike, because I realized the stranger didn't intend to be corrected. He intended to contest. And when Mr. Denslow reached for the urn to secure it, the metal table shuddered under his hands, not violently, just enough to make him jerk back, and the urn lid slid open the tiniest amount, releasing a faint breath of gray dust that rose like smoke and then drifted. And in that drifting ash, I saw the shape. Not fully formed, but outlined the thin, hunched shoulders, the ragged clothing, the grin standing behind Mr. Denslow like a shadow learning solidity. And Mr. Denslow gasped and backed away, and the ash shape turned its head toward me. And though it still had no voice, I heard meaning in the way the room's silence bent around it. No. Then I realized the correction was not simply a swap of containers, it was an eviction. And evictions are never polite. And Mr. Denslow, now trembling, did something that surprised me. He grabbed a heavy metal lid clamp and slammed it down over the urn, pinning the lid shut. Then he shouted for another employee, someone named Raoul, and a second man rushed in, seeing the fogging breath, smelling the damp soil, and his face tightened with fear. He tried to hide with professionalism, and together they wrapped the wrong urn in a thick plastic containment bag, as if handling hazardous waste. And as they did, the ash inside writhed, the bag ballooning slightly as if something were pushing outward, and my heart hammered as I clutched Noah's correct urn against my chest like a rescued child. And for a brief, desperate moment I thought it was over, that the wrong ashes would be sealed and stored and the anchor broken. But then the lights flickered again, and in the blink of dimness, the bagged urn shifted across the steel table by itself with a scraping sound that made my teeth ache, and a soft, wet chuckle filled the room like breath through dirt. And Raoul went rigid, whispering, "No," under his breath, and Mr. Denslow's clipboard clattered to the floor as he stumbled back, because the stranger wasn't just refusing to be corrected, he was furious. And fury from something that doesn't breathe feels like pressure on the organs, and the stainless steel shelves began vibrating faintly, containers rattling, labels trembling, as if the room itself were shivering. And in that chaos, the ash shape behind the plastic bag sharpened enough that I saw it raise one arm and point not at me, at Noah's urn in my arms, claiming it, wanting it, as if he believed all urns were interchangeable now, all names swappable. And I understood the horror's true core. The dead don't fear death. They fear being misnamed, misplaced, erased. And this stranger had been erased for years, unlabeled, unclaimed. And now he'd found a warm address and refused to go back into anonymity. and my mind raced with the brutal logic of it. The stranger wanted my house because it was a home, and he wanted me because I was alive, and he wanted Noah's identity, because it was legitimate, because names are power even after death. And before I could stop myself, I shouted, voice cracking, that he wasn't Noah, that he didn't belong, that the house wasn't his, and the room's temperature dropped again, as if my words had offended something ancient, and the ash in the containment bag surged, slamming against the plastic so hard it bulged, and Mr. Denslow screamed for security, and in that moment I realized we were in the most dangerous part of the correction, the struggle right at the border. The exact instant two identities were being swapped back, because misplacement is a doorway, and doorways love conflict, and I turned and ran from the room, clutching Noah's urn, not caring about procedure, not caring about signatures, because I understood the only way to end this was to bring the correct ashes home and bury them properly, anchor Noah to his rightful place. While the stranger sealed, Furious was returned to the facility's locked shelves, where anonymity could swallow him again, and behind me the containment bag scraped across steel like something dragging itself toward the exit, the wet chuckle fading into a hiss. And as I burst into the parking lot under the gray sky, my lungs burning with cold air, I swore I heard bare feet scuffing faintly on asphalt behind me, already learning a new route, already practicing how to follow Noah home. I drove home like someone fleeing a fire that only I could see, hands clenched so hard on the steering wheel my wrists ached. Noah's correct urn pressed against my ribs in the passenger seat with a seatbelt crossed over it like a child. And the entire way back to Juniper Hollow Lane, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, expecting to see headlights too close, expecting to see a figure in the back seat smiling in that smug, silent way. Because the worst part of a haunting isn't the moment it shows itself. It's the moment you learn it can follow. And when I reached my street, the porch light was already on, even though I hadn't left it on. A small domestic detail that made my stomach drop, because it felt like the house had been awake without me. And as I pulled into the driveway, the air around the property smelled wrong. Again, damp soil, smoke, wet pennies stronger than ever, like someone had been digging in the yard all afternoon. And I stumbled out of the car, clutching the urn, and rushed to the front door and nearly slipped on the porch step because my legs were shaking too hard. And the moment I stepped inside, I understood that the stranger had not waited politely at the crematory for me to finish my transaction, because the living room lamps were off, the house dim in a way I never left it, and the mantel clock was stopped at 11:40, the same time he had first appeared earlier in the week, as if the house had decided to pin the day to his rhythm. And in the dark silence I heard it, the soft scuff of bare feet on wood, slow, close, almost leisurely, and my mouth went dry as the hallway curtain stirred again, like someone had brushed past it, and I forced myself to move deeper into the house because running back outside felt pointless. Outside is too open, too exposed. Whereas inside at least I knew the corners, and as I stepped into the living room, the damp soil smell thickened so abruptly it felt like breathing through a wet cloth. And there he was, not in shadow now, but in the faint gray spill of street lamp light through the window, standing right beside the mantel where the wrong urn used to sit, shoulders hunched, ragged clothes hanging off him as if he'd crawled out of a storage unit of discarded dead. And he looked pleased, not angry, not frantic, pleased like a man who has already decided how the night will end. And he began his dance without prelude, slow looping steps around the coffee table, half-circle scuffs, the exact pattern I'd cleaned from the carpet days earlier. And as he moved, the air in the room grew heavier, the walls seeming to listen, the furniture seeming to accept his presence, and I realized with a sick clarity that the house had been rehearsing his ownership while I was gone, training itself to him the way it had trained itself to Noah. And the stranger turned his head toward me and smiled wider, and though no words came, the meaning landed like a hand closing around my throat. You brought him back. Good. Now I can take it all. And I clutched Noah's urn harder and shouted his name like an anchor thrown into water. And at the sound of Noah's name, the stranger's grin flickered, not fading, but tightening like the name was a thorn in his mouth. And the lamps around the room flickered once, as if the electrical system had been startled. And in that flicker, I saw ash on the stranger's bare feet, fresh gray dust that shouldn't exist in my home now that the wrong urn was gone. And I understood then that he wasn't fully anchored by the ashes anymore. He was anchored by habit, by claim, by the ritual of dancing in the place where I sleep. So I did the only thing Celine-like folk wisdom had taught me through all this. I changed the ritual. I refused to let him use my bed as the stage, and I ran not upstairs, not into the bedroom, but out the back door into the yard, clutching Noah's urn, forcing the stranger to follow into a place that wasn't his, into open ground that still belonged to the living, and behind me the bare feet scuffed faster, the dance rhythm turning into pursuit, and the night air hit my lungs cold and sharp, the backyard grass slick with rain, the sky a bruised gray blue, and I stumbled toward the old maple tree near the fence where Noah had once hung a string of lights during summer, and I dropped to my knees in wet grass and began digging with my hands like an animal, because I didn't have a shovel and time had become a luxury, and the soil was cold and stubborn and smelled like life, and my nails broke and dirt packed under them, and I didn't care, because grief had finally become action. And behind me I heard the stranger step onto the patio stones and stop, not because he was afraid of the yard, but because he recognized what I was doing, and the air thickened with that damp soil stink again. Yet this time it was mixed with my own raw earth smell, the smell of a living woman digging, and I heard the stranger's wet chuckle, closer now, and I felt the grass behind me compress as he approached, and I forced myself to keep digging until the hole was deep enough to feel like a promise, and then I lowered Noah's urn into it with trembling hands, whispering his name again and again, not as a spell, but as the only true thing left in the night. And in that moment, as the urn touched the soil, the strangest thing happened. The air seemed to exhale, the porch light behind me flared brighter, and a sudden gust moved through the yard, snapping the maple branches so hard they groaned, and the neighbor's wind chime rang once, a single clean note that cut through the damp, and I absolutely felt something settle, like a key turning in a lock. And the stranger hissed softly, not a word, not a scream, just a sound of irritation and disbelief. And when I looked over my shoulder, I saw him frozen at the edge of the yard, feet on the patio stones, unwilling or unable to step onto the grass beyond a certain line, and his grin had faltered into a sour expression of frustration as if some rule had been invoked without his permission. And I realized then what the mistake had truly been. The ashes on my mantle had made my house a cremation shelf, an unclaimed storage space, a place where the wrong dead could file a claim. But burying Noah in living earth, giving him a rightful boundary, had corrected not only paperwork, but spiritual geography. It had told the house who belonged and who did not, so I shoveled the dirt back into the hole with my hands, packing it down, sobbing silently in the rain, and the stranger began to move again, but not his confident dance, his movements jittery, agitated, like a man forced to dance on a stage that no longer wants him. And as I pressed the last wet clump of soil down, the stranger's outline thinned, becoming less solid, his ragged clothes turning paler, and the damp soil smell that had belonged to him began to retreat, replaced by the clean, honest smell of fresh earth I'd disturbed. And he took one step forward as if trying to cross the invisible line, and when his bare foot touched the grass, the ground beneath it darkened, not with rot, but with a sudden spreading patch of pale ash like a burn mark, and his face twisted, and he withdrew with a silent snarl. And in that moment the house behind me creaked, not the settling creak of wood, but a long, deep groan like a living thing correcting its posture, and the mantel clock inside started ticking again. Not from 11:40, but from the actual time, as if time had been released. And the stranger stared at me with a hatred that felt almost human, then lifted his arms one last time as if to begin his dance again. But the rhythm wouldn't hold. His feet scraped uncertainly, and with each scrape he grew more transparent, the outline of his body breaking apart into drifting ash that scattered into the night wind. And the final thing he did before dissolving completely was point at me with a crooked finger. Not triumphant now, but accusing, as if the only vengeance left to the unclaimed dead is to make you remember their existence. And then he was gone, leaving only a faint gray dust on the patio stones and one last half-circle scuff like a signature. And I collapsed onto the wet grass beside Noah's fresh grave, sobbing without sound, because even victory in these stories tastes like grief. And in the weeks that followed, the house finally began to feel widowed in the way it should have. From the beginning, quiet, empty, honest, No damp soil smell, no bare footsteps, no smug dance in the bedroom, only the ordinary loneliness of loss. Yet the ending didn't fully close, because months later, on a calm evening when spring rain tapped softly at the windows, I found my front doormat slightly crooked as if someone had wiped their feet there, and when I lifted it to straighten it, I saw, pressed into the concrete beneath, a faint ash-gray mark shaped like the beginning step of a dance. And I understood with a chill that mistakes don't always disappear. Sometimes they simply move on, searching for another mantle, another wrong name, another warm house where the dead can pretend to belong. The forbidden deity of the glass cabinet. The first time I saw him, I thought of winter. Not the season, the idea of winter. Stillness, clean edges, beauty that doesn't ask to be touched. He stood in the center of a velvet-lined case, tall as a forearm, carved from pale stone with the kind of finesse that makes your throat tighten before your mind can explain why. A young man with a serene face and narrow, downcast eyes, hair gathered back as if held by an invisible ribbon. Lips just barely parted, half a breath away from speech. And the strangest part wasn't the craftsmanship. It was the way the sculptor had captured softness in something meant to outlast centuries. You don't expect tenderness from stone. You don't expect grace from something that was buried. But the statue carried both, like a secret. His hands were held in front of his body, one palm turned slightly upward, the other angled like he was offering an oath or receiving one. When I leaned closer, I saw faint lines etched into the sleeves of his robe, patterns so delicate they looked like flowing water. The surface had tiny specks of darker mineral running through it, like ink marbling inside porcelain. I remember whispering one word without realizing I'd spoken out loud. Perfect. The dealer smiled as if he'd been waiting for that word specifically. His name was Mr. Han, and he operated out of a private showroom above a tea shop on Renford Quay, the kind of waterfront district where money hides behind quiet doors. The room smelled faintly of old paper, cedar, and incense that wasn't burning anymore. He didn't offer me tea. He offered me an object, and that should have been my first warning, because in the world of antiquities, tea means conversation, negotiation, human warmth. But the statue didn't invite warmth. It invited possession. Mr. Han spoke softly, almost reverently. He told me the statue came from inland China. Very old, very rare, very sensitive to light. He said it had belonged to a private family collection for generations, until debts turned lineage into liquidation. He never said the statue's name. He never said what it represented. He spoke around it, the way people speak around dangerous things. I didn't press. That's the second warning. I was too busy feeling what I always felt when I found something exceptional. That subtle tightening in the chest. The hungry certainty that this is why I built my life the way I did. My name is Jonas Creed, and for most of my career, I've been called a collector, an investor, a patron, whatever word makes obsession sound respectable. I kept my gallery Creed cabinet in a converted townhouse near the river, all polished dark wood, glass cases, and curated silence. I bought relics and sold them to men who wanted history to sit on their shelves like trophies. I told myself it was preservation, but deep down, I liked the feeling of owning something older than me, something the world couldn't make again. A statue like this wasn't simply an object. It was a turning point, and in business, turning points are everything. I paid more than I should have, enough that Mr. Han's smile looked briefly relieved. He wrapped the statue in layers of silk as if packing a sleeping royal child. Before he closed the case, his hand hovered above the carved face, hesitating. Then he said something in a language I didn't understand. A single sentence, whispered, not to me, to the statue. The hairs on my arms rose. I laughed lightly and asked what he'd said. Mr. Han's eyes didn't meet mine. Just manners, he replied. Then he slid the box to me across the table. His fingers lingered on it a fraction too long, like he wasn't sure he was allowed to let go. That evening, I placed the statue in the glass cabinet in my private study. I didn't put him in the public gallery room downstairs. I didn't want him seen by clients, yet not until I'd decided what story I wanted attached to him. Some objects are art. Some objects are leverage. This one felt like both. The cabinet itself was imported Italian glass with a locking mechanism that clicked like a gun being cocked. I lined the interior with black velvet so the pale stone looked almost luminous. When I shut the door, the statue stared downward in perfect calm, as if he hadn't noticed he'd been imprisoned, or as if he'd been waiting for the cabinet. The first unusual thing happened that night at 2:09 a.m. I remembered the time because I wasn't asleep yet. I was lying in bed, scrolling mindlessly through a news app, pretending I wasn't thinking about the statue downstairs. The townhouse was quiet in its familiar way, pipes ticking, distant traffic, the soft electric hum of the refrigerator. Then I heard it, a sound so thin I almost dismissed it as imagination. A faint sob, not a woman crying loudly, not a dramatic wail, a restrained, exhausted sob like someone crying into their sleeve so they won't be heard. I sat up, breath held. The sound came again, softer this time, from downstairs, from the direction of the study. For a long moment I didn't move. You'd think I would go straight down like a brave man in a movie. But reality isn't a movie. Reality is you, alone, at night, trying not to admit you're afraid of your own house. I told myself it was plumbing, a neighbor, the building settling. I got out of bed anyway, barefoot, robe hanging loose. I walked down the stairs. Each step creaked like it was accusing me of curiosity. The study door was closed. I don't remember closing it. I stared at it for a moment, then reached for the knob. Cold, the kind of cold metal gets when it's touched by winter air. Except my house wasn't cold. I opened the door. Nothing moved. No shadow darted away. No candle flickered. Just my study in darkness, except for the glass cabinet. The cabinet was glowing faintly, not brightly, not like a light bulb, like moonlight trapped inside glass. A pale shimmer clinging to the statue's face, making it look slightly damp around the eyes. The sobbing sound came again, very quiet, very close, and that was when I realized it wasn't coming from the room. It was coming from inside my head. I froze. The sound didn't echo like normal noise. It didn't bounce off walls. It vibrated behind my ears, like memory being played through bone. The sobbing became words still not spoken aloud, but shaped clearly enough that my mind could understand them. A language I'd never learned, yet I understood it anyway. In the way you understand someone's grief without translating it. Wronged, betrayed, buried without name, locked behind glass. My throat tightened. The statue remained perfectly still, but the air around him felt heavy, like a room full of invisible mourners. I backed away slowly, shutting the door without taking my eyes off the cabinet. In bed, I tried to convince myself I'd been dreaming, but at 3:15 a.m., my phone buzzed with a notification from an unknown number. A single message. Near them. No signature. No emoji. No threat. Just instruction. I didn't tell anyone. Collectors don't confess weakness. Not to colleagues. Not to rivals. Especially not to Silas Vane. Silas was my biggest competitor in the city, an antiques broker with clean nails and cruel instincts. We'd fought over acquisitions for years. Jade seals, Tang era bronze, a lacquered reliquary that cost a marriage. Silas believed the world belonged to men who took what they wanted. If he suspected I'd acquired something extraordinary, he'd circle me like a shark. So I kept the statue hidden upstairs behind locked glass. And the sobbing returned the next night, and the next, always after 2 a.m., always restrained, always full of ancient bitterness, began affecting me in subtle ways. In meetings, I'd drift, hearing faint cries underneath people's voices. In elevators, I'd smell incense that wasn't burning. In the shower, I'd find myself whispering apologies I didn't understand. The obsession grew like mold. I started spending more time in the study, not even touching the cabinet, just sitting there in the leather chair with a drink I didn't taste, staring at the statue like it held a secret it might share if I waited long enough. And the strangest part, I began to feel honored, like the cries had chosen me, like my cabinet had become a temple. That sense, dangerous, intoxicating, was what finally made me reckless. Because on the fourth night, while I sat watching the statue with the lights off, the sobbing stopped mid-breath. A clean cut, sudden silence so deep it felt like pressure on my eardrums. And then inside my mind, another voice arrived. Not sobbing, not pleading, smooth as cold silk. You can keep me. My skin prickled. I whispered aloud. Who are you? The statue didn't move, but the cabinet glass fogged lightly from the inside, as if something breathed against it. Then, the voice still inside my skull answered with a kind of amused patience. Not yours. And for the first time since I bought him, the carved lips of the statue seemed slightly different. Not smiling, but no longer neutral either, as if the stone face knew something about me I hadn't admitted yet. After the fourth night, the study stopped feeling like a room and began feeling like a mouth, as if every time I entered it I was stepping into something that could close around me, because the glass cabinet no longer merely displayed the statue. It contained an atmosphere cool, faintly metallic, threaded with incense that wasn't burning, and the silence around it had a peculiar density, the kind that presses against the skin and makes you speak softer without knowing why. And I found myself returning to that cabinet the way people return to a locked door after hearing something move behind it, not from courage, but from compulsion, because once the voice inside my skull had said, "You can keep me," I could no longer tolerate not hearing it again, and that frightened me more than any haunting sob, because sorrow can be resisted, but invitation makes you complicit. And within a week, the pattern of my life reorganized itself around the statue's schedule. My mornings shortened, my meetings rushed, my gallery hours cut, and every evening I began drifting upstairs before midnight like a man sleepwalking toward confession, sitting in the leather chair across from the cabinet, with the lights off and a glass of scotch untouched in my hand, waiting, listening for the faint sobbing of the wronged dead to return. Yet the sobbing rarely returned fully now. Instead, it arrived in fragments, like phrases broken into ash, and those fragments were always the same themes: unjust trial, false witness, chained wrists, burial without rites, name erased, family slaughtered, loyal men punished, traitors rewarded, and the repetition worked on me like a chant, the way a song lyric repeated often enough stops being music and becomes belief. And I began to carry those injustices in my body during the day, flinching at casual laughter, bristling at compliments, staring too hard at anyone who seemed smug, as if the statue had loaned me its ancient resentment and asked me to wear it like a suit. And the worst part was how quickly it became pleasurable, not in a grotesque way, but in a subtle, intoxicating way, the way righteousness feels like heat in the chest, because the voice never begged me for mercy. It never asked for forgiveness. It asked for attention, and attention, especially from a man like me, feels like power. So I started feeding it without admitting I was feeding it. I researched dynasties late into the night. I read translated court records. I hunted down obscure museum catalogs and scholarly articles about beautiful male deities and funerary guardians. And though none of the texts described my statue exactly, every mention of carved serenity, masking, violent devotion made my skin prickle, and I began to see my cabinet differently. Not as a display, but as an altar. Because the statue's beauty wasn't simply aesthetic, it was strategic, a velvet glove over a clenched fist. And then the business consequences began with a precision so clean I could almost deny their connection. Because one afternoon a small dealer who owed me money, an oily man named Harrow, arrived at Creed Cabinet with a smug grin and a cheap lawsuit threat. And while he stood in my gallery, insulting me in the soft, careful tone of someone who thinks he has leverage, I felt a sudden tightening behind my ears, like pressure change, and in my mind I heard, not words but a quiet click, the sound of a lock turning. And Harrow's grin froze mid-syllable as if the muscles had forgotten what shape to hold, his eyes widening with a strange animal confusion. Then he coughed once, hard, like something had punched the air out of him. And he staggered backward, palm slapping the glass display case for support. And the glass didn't shatter, but it rang with a low note, like a bell struck underwater. And Harrow's face went gray, not pale like fear, but gray like oxygen leaving. And he made a choking noise that wasn't dramatic enough for anyone to call it supernatural. It sounded like an allergic reaction, like a sudden spasm of the diaphragm, except there was no swelling, no rash, no visible cause, just an invisible force, squeezing him tighter than panic could explain. And he collapsed to his knees, with both hands pressed to his ribs as if trying to keep his chest from caving in. And when my assistant rushed forward, Harrow held up a trembling finger as if to beg for help. but he couldn't speak, his mouth opening and closing around empty air. And then this is the part I still replay with an ice-cold knot in my gut. Harrow turned his eyes toward me with something that looked like accusation, as if he knew I was the room's gravity. And in that stare, my mind heard a single smooth sentence, not spoken aloud, but delivered directly into thought, with luxurious calm. "He lies." And then Harrow vomited water, not blood. Just thin, clear water, like the sea had filled his lungs. And he wheezed and wheezed until the paramedics came and dragged him away, while I stood perfectly still, face arranged into concern, hands clean, heart thudding with the sick shock of witnessing a miracle you didn't request. And for the rest of that day, the gallery felt subtly tilted in my favor. People spoke softer to me. Negotiations went smoother, and though none of them knew why, the air around me carried the faint warning of something unseen standing behind my shoulder. And I should have been horrified enough to confess everything to someone, to a priest or doctor or the police, but instead I felt something worse. Gratitude, because Harrow had threatened me and the world had corrected him without staining my hands. And once you taste correction without consequence, morality becomes negotiable, and the statues seem to know that, because that night, when I entered the study with the cabinet, the sobbing returned briefly, one exhausted, broken sob like a relic of grief. And then the smooth voice came again, warmer now, almost intimate. You hear them, and the cabinet glass fogged faintly from the inside, as if the statue breathed, and I whispered, against reason, "What are you?" And the voice answered with a patience that felt ancient. Not yours, as always. But then it added a phrase that made my mouth go dry. I am owed. And after that, my rival Silas Vane began to unravel in ways that felt too perfectly aligned with my private prayers, because Silas had always moved through the city like a man, certain the law and the market bent for him. And when he heard whispers that I'd acquired a perfect Chinese piece, he began circling, sending clients my way with false inquiries, calling dealers I trusted, spreading rumors that my authentication team was sloppy, and each rumor hit like a pebble against glass, until one evening his assistant called mine with trembling urgency to ask if I knew where Silas was, because Silas hadn't come home, and the next morning news broke quietly through our circles that Silas had been found in his private storage unit by the docks, alive but ruined, the air knocked out of him, his body folded oddly, as if gravity had doubled for a moment, ribs cracked without visible trauma, face bruised without fists, and the story among medics was mechanical compression, which made no sense because no machine had moved. The storage cameras showed him walking inside alone, closing the door behind him, then suddenly buckling as if the floor had turned to stone under his feet, and in the footage, he looked upward once, eyes wide, as if something above him had leaned down, and then the camera glitched into static for 8 seconds, and when it returned, Silas was on the ground clawing weakly at nothing, and I watched that footage later on a dealer's phone with sweat cooling on my spine because I recognized the same distortion from my own phone when I tried to record the statue's influence. And the sickest part was that my first thought was not pity. It was relief, because Silas had always been my shadow competitor, and now something had crushed him without leaving fingerprints. And I went home that night and sat in the study facing the cabinet like a man awaiting judgment, and the statue's carved face seemed softer than ever in the dim light. Lips parted with that almost breath, eyes downcast as if modest, and in my mind I heard the faint sobs of the wrong dead again, thousands of them, layered like wind through reeds. Then the smooth voice cut through, sweet as chilled silk. You understand now, and I should have asked what it wanted. I should have demanded terms, but obsession had already eaten my caution, and without meaning to, I found myself speaking the phrase that doomed me. Tell me who hurt you. And the moment the words left my mouth, the cabinet lock clicked by itself, not opening, just acknowledging, and the study air thickened as if the room had filled with invisible witnesses, and the voice answered not with a name, but with a sensation, images flashing behind my eyes, a court hall lined with officials, a kneeling man with ink-stained hands, a document stamped in blood-red cinnabar, a beautiful young deity carved to resemble the betrayed one, sealed as a vessel for grievance, and then a final image that made my skin crawl, myself standing at this same cabinet, key in hand, smiling with pride, while behind me, an ancient ledger flipped open, pages whispering as if eager, and in that moment, I realized my obsession hadn't been accidental at all. It had been summoned, groomed, cultivated, and that the statue's beauty wasn't merely meant to be admired, it was meant to be chosen, because the most dangerous vengeance never arrives as ugliness. It arrives as perfection, something you want to keep close until you forget the difference between collector and offering. After Silas Vane's collapse, the city's antique circles shifted in the way flocks shift when a predator is nearby, conversations growing quieter, glances lingering longer, invitations arriving with more caution, and though nobody said my name directly, I felt it in the air like ozone. Jonas Creed has something. Jonas Creed is dangerous now, not because I'd threatened anyone, but because threat had begun to orbit me like a moon, and the sickest part was that I enjoyed it in a small, private corner of my chest. A corner I didn't know existed until fear from others started feeding it, because power does that. It reveals what you are capable of wanting, and at night, while the river wind rattled the townhouse windows and the gallery downstairs settled into its curated silence, I returned to the upstairs study with a devotion that resembled prayer, sitting before the glass cabinet as if waiting for communion, and the statue's face remained serene, soft-lipped, downcast-eyed, impossibly tender, yet the atmosphere around it had become sharper, almost formal, like the air in a courthouse right before sentencing, and the sobbing voices began arriving earlier now, no longer confined to 2 a.m., sometimes surfacing when I was brushing my teeth or signing invoices, a thin chorus of unjust deaths pressing against my hearing, as if the statue's grief had become portable, as if it had learned to ride inside my body, and the more I heard them, the more my mind began translating their pain into a single, simple hunger, correction, 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 and that hunger started infecting my waking decisions, because I'd always believed my business instincts were clean and rational, yet now each negotiation felt like a moral trial, each rival a potential liar, each delay an insult, and I caught myself staring at people's faces the way I stare at paintings, looking for guilt in their posture, deceit in their eyes. And if I suspected it, even slightly, the pressure behind my ears would return like a hand tightening a cord, and the statue's smooth voice would offer its opinion without being asked, not always in words, but in certainty, and certainty is the most addictive drug of all, because it feels like righteousness, and righteousness is a wonderful disguise for cruelty. So I began to speak to the cabinet more openly, no longer pretending it was only an object, asking it questions in a low voice late at night as if my house had become a confessional, and the statue never moved, never blinked, never changed expression, yet the cabinet glass fogged faintly whenever the voice answered, as if something inside exhaled, and the answers always circled back to the same theme: debt, grievance, owed. And one night this was the true turning point. The moment I stopped being merely haunted and became enlisted, I unlocked the cabinet without fully realizing I was doing it, because my fingers retrieved the key from the drawer, as if commanded by muscle memory. The lock clicked, the door swung open, and the air that spilled out of the cabinet was colder than the room by several degrees, carrying a smell like old incense trapped in sealed wood, and my skin prickled the way it prickles near a deep drop, and I reached in and touched the statue's sleeve lightly with my fingertips, expecting stone coolness, expecting lifeless hardness, but the surface felt wrong, not warm like flesh, not cold like marble, something in between, like polished bone, and my stomach tightened as I realized the craftsmanship was too perfect, the material too smooth. And when I leaned closer, I saw faint lines along the robe that I hadn't noticed before, not carved patterns, but hairline fractures filled with darker pigment, like ink running in tiny channels beneath the surface. And the moment my fingertips rested there, the sobbing chorus in my mind surged so loud, I gasped, and with it came a flood of images, not as dreams, but as lived memory, a long hall of officials, scrolls and seals, a kneeling man pleading innocence, a witness speaking lies with a calm face, a sentence delivered without mercy, wrists bound, a body dragged, a name erased, and then the image of a statue being carved. My statue, its features modeled after the wronged one, its beauty designed as bait, and I tore my hand away and stumbled back, heart hammering, because I realized the statue didn't only contain grief. It contained a mechanism, a storage device for resentment so old it had compressed into something functional, and the voice inside my skull so close now, it felt like my own thought whispered with smooth satisfaction. "You touched the vow," and I demanded, trembling. "What vow?" And the reply arrived like silk sliding across a blade. The vow to correct the world. And in the days that followed, the statue's influence stopped being occasional and became operational, because people who had tried to undercut me began suffering the same kind of invisible compression Silas had suffered. Not always severe, not always public, but enough to derail them. An auction rival fainting mid-bid, with ribs bruised as if hugged too hard by air. A dealer who forged provenance losing his voice for weeks, his throat intact yet sound refusing to emerge. A smug appraiser waking with his hands stiff and clawed as if he'd slept gripping stone. And each incident would ripple through the city's networks, and my name would rise in whispers, and I would pretend shock while privately listening to the statue's chorus, quieting after each correction, like satisfied mourners, and the satisfaction I felt should have terrified me. But obsession has a way of whitening the soul, bleaching moral color into simple shapes, deserved and undeserved, guilty and innocent, owed and paid. And I began to believe, dangerously, that maybe these punishments were justice. Maybe the statue had chosen me because I had always seen through people, because I had always known the market's hypocrisies, because I had always hated liars. And the voice encouraged this delusion with careful kindness, praising my discernment, praising my devotion, calling me a keeper, a witness, and every time it used those words, the pressure behind my ears eased like a hand loosening its grip, rewarding me, training me. And one afternoon, while examining the cabinet under daylight, I noticed a new detail that made my blood cool. A faint mark on the inside of the cabinet's back panel, like a smudge of ink. And when I wiped it, it didn't smear. It remained, and I leaned closer and realized it wasn't a smudge. It was a character, an old Chinese character I couldn't read, etched so lightly it almost seemed like a stain rather than carving. And there were more beside it, faint strokes forming lines like writing, like a ledger being started. And as I stared, the writing seemed to deepen, not moving but becoming more visible. And I felt the bizarre certainty that it was responding to me, that each correction the statue performed added another entry, another line, another accounting. And dread rose, because accounting implies finality, implies a due date, implies that someone is keeping track not only of debts being paid, but of who is paying them. And that night I stood before the cabinet and demanded, truly demanded, "What am I to you?" And the statue's smooth voice answered with unsettling gentleness, "You are useful." And I felt insult flare because usefulness is not companionship. Usefulness is toolhood. And I tried to shut the cabinet door with force, but the hinge resisted slightly, as if the cabinet itself didn't want to close. And in that resistance, my mind saw the ancient court hall again, saw the kneeling man's wrists bound, saw the witness smiling as lies spilled, and I realized with a chill that vengeance has no interest in fairness. It only wants momentum. And that is when the statue began to turn its gaze toward me, not physically. Its eyes remained downcast, but the attention shifted. The pressure behind my ears now accompanied by an internal sensation, like a finger tracing my spine. And the chorus of sobbing voices changed tone, becoming less pleading and more anticipatory, like a crowd awaiting the next sacrifice. And one night, just before dawn, I woke with the taste of incense on my tongue, and found my right palm stained faintly black, as if I'd touched wet ink in my sleep. And when I washed it, the stain didn't fully disappear. It sank into the lines of my hand, into the creases of my skin, like a signature being written into me. And as I stared at those darkened lines, my heart beating too loudly in the quiet house, I understood the true horror of a deity hidden in beauty. It doesn't only punish your enemies, it begins writing its ledger under your skin. And once you are listed, you are no longer the owner of anything, not even yourself. After the ink settled into the creases of my palm, my life stopped feeling like I was making choices and started feeling like I was being guided through a very elegant corridor toward a locked door. because the stain didn't behave like dirt or dye. It behaved like intent, darkening slightly whenever I stood too close to the cabinet, warming faintly when the statue's chorus of grievances rose in my skull. And that subtle response was the true violation. My body was beginning to act like one of the cabinet's internal panels, a surface for entries, a place where the deity could record what it owned, and I tried to resist in ways that still flattered my ego, the pathetic methods of a man who believes he can out-negotiate the supernatural, locking the cabinet key in a safe downstairs, covering the glass case with a heavy cloth at night, sleeping in a guest room to avoid being pulled upstairs, filling my schedule with dinners and meetings and bright public spaces, like sunlight could sterilize obsession. But the moment I left the house, I carried the statue with me anyway. Not physically, yet psychologically like a splinter in the brain, because in crowded restaurants I would suddenly taste incense on the back of my tongue. In taxis I would hear faint sobbing in the engine hum. In boardrooms I would catch my reflection in a glossy table and see, for a half-second too long, a softness in my own expression that wasn't mine, a composed, downcast calm that looked eerily like the statue's face. And people began responding to me differently, speaking to me with a strange, careful respect, as if my presence had acquired a ceremonial gravity, and I realized with cold dread that the deity's power wasn't only crushing rivals behind closed doors. It was editing how the world perceived me, reshaping my social face into something untouchable, because gods don't only punish, they enthrone. And enthronement is another kind of cage. And the more my competitors fell, dealers mysteriously hospitalized, brokers suddenly ruined, appraisers finding themselves unable to speak lies without choking, the more the antique world started treating me like a man you shouldn't cross. Which meant I gained access to auctions I'd been barred from, collections that used to be not for sale, suddenly opening like flowers, and I told myself I was merely benefiting from karma, from luck, from reputation. Yet every time I used that advantage, the ink in my palm would darken slightly in the lines like a pen being pressed harder, and at night, when I inevitably found myself back in the upstairs study despite every vow I'd made, I would sit facing the cabinet and hear the smooth voice purr approval in my skull, warm as velvet, saying nothing explicit, yet filling the room with the certainty that I was behaving correctly, that I was making the right offerings. And one evening after a particularly brutal day where a rival curator's career collapsed because of a forged provenance scandal that surfaced at exactly the worst time, I returned home, shaking not with guilt but with adrenaline, and I stood before the cabinet and asked, quietly, what it wanted from me, because it was no longer enough to be useful, without understanding why. And the cabinet glass fogged from the inside as if something exhaled, and the voice answered with a simplicity that made my stomach turn. A vessel. And I laughed nervously and asked what that meant, and in response the sobbing chorus rose for the first time in weeks into a full layered wail, thousands of restrained voices suddenly unrestrained. Not loud in the room, but loud in my bones, and within that sound I felt images sliding into place like a puzzle, an ancient court condemning an innocent man, the creation of a deity statue modeled after his beauty, to contain the grievance so it would never fade, the vow inscribed into stone that the wronged would never again be voiceless, the need, centuries later, for a living conduit strong enough to carry that vow back into the world. And then I understood the phrase, a vessel, the way you understand a diagnosis before it is spoken aloud. It wasn't asking for a caretaker, it was appointing a host, and disgust flooded me because the statue's beauty suddenly looked different, less tender and more predatory, like the serene face of a mask designed to lure hands into touching it, and I attempted to back away, to reassert my ownership, to remind myself that I had paid for this object, that it sat in my cabinet because I had acquired it. But the moment the thought formed, the ink in my palm burned with a sharp sting, and I heard the voice, colder now, strip smooth, repeating the phrase it had always told me, but with sharpened meaning. Not yours. And the cabinet lock clicked by itself, though the key was not in my hand, and the glass door eased open a fraction as if inviting me to come closer, and I wanted to refuse. I truly did. But the air in the room thickened into that courthouse pressure again, the ceremonial stillness that makes you feel watched from all angles, and my body moved with reluctant obedience, stepping toward the cabinet. Because obsession is not simply desire, it is rehearsal. And I had rehearsed kneeling before this beauty for weeks. And now the deity collected what the rehearsal had prepared. So I reached toward the statue without intending to, fingertips hovering over its carved sleeve, and when my skin met the polished surface, the statue's material felt less like stone than ever, more like sealed bone warmed by breath, and the ink in my palm seemed to flow, not visibly, but sensation-wise, as if the lines of my hand were channels and something inside them was sliding toward the contact point, and I gasped and tried to pull away, but my fingers held fast for a second too long, and in that second the statue's sobbing chorus collapsed into a single voice, mine, except not mine, because I heard my own throat in my head speaking words I hadn't chosen in an ancient cadence, a vow being recited as if my tongue had been borrowed, and I felt humiliation so fierce, it nearly made me vomit, because there is nothing more degrading than hearing yourself used as a mouthpiece, and when I finally jerked my hand away, I saw a change on the statue. A faint darkening along the carved robe sleeve, as if ink had seeped into the stone from the inside, forming thin lines that looked eerily similar to the lines in my palm, and I realized the exchange had gone both ways. The deity wasn't merely infecting me, it was imprinting itself through me, linking our surfaces so we could not easily separate, and I stumbled back, clutching my hand, and at that exact moment, my phone buzzed downstairs with a news alert about another competitor. An exporter who'd undercut me for years found dead in his office after a freak structural collapse. The official story stating a shelving unit had fallen on him, but the details were impossible because the shelves were bolted to concrete and the security footage showed no movement before he suddenly folded to the ground as if pressed flat by invisible weight. And as I read the alert, my stomach turned, because I hadn't even thought about that man today. Not once. Meaning the deity was no longer responding only to my grudges. It was acting independently, widening its justice into a hunger that didn't require my permission, and the horror of that realization settled heavy. I had become a door it could walk through, and once a god finds a door, it doesn't stop at one room. And that night, when I finally tried to sleep, I woke again and again to the sensation of fingertips tracing the ink lines in my palm as if reading them like scripture. And each time I woke, I smelled incense stronger than before, and each time I drifted off, I dreamed of an ancient ledger pages made of thin, lacquered wood flipping open by itself, while a beautiful, faceless official dipped a brush into black ink and wrote my name with slow, deliberate strokes. And when I jolted awake at 2:09 a.m., the exact minute of the first sob, I found my bedroom closet door standing open, though I always kept it closed. And inside that dark rectangle, the air shimmered faintly like heat, haze, as if something had been stored there waiting, and from within the closet came the softest sound of all, a brush tip touching paper, beginning a new line. I used to believe the most dangerous objects were the ones that looked ugly, the ones that announced their evil with sharp edges and crude symbols, but the statue taught me something far worse. Beauty is the most efficient trap, because it makes you lean in, it makes you volunteer your distance. And by the time the closet in my bedroom shimmered with that faint heat haze and the sound of brush on paper whispered from within it, I knew my house had stopped being a home and become an annex of the cabinet, a place where grievances could be archived and deployed. And I also knew deep down, in the sick old instincts the statue had awakened, that the deity's next step would be to expand beyond my rivals, because vengeance is never satisfied with one neighborhood. It wants a kingdom, and the only thing stopping it from claiming more lives under the guise of correction was the remaining illusion that I still held the key, that I was still an owner rather than an offering. So I made my last attempt at ownership the only way a collector can. I tried to sell it. I called Mr. Han from Renford Quay with shaking hands and forced cheer in my voice, telling him I had reconsidered the acquisition, telling him I'd found a buyer in Europe, telling him I wanted to transfer it back through his network, anything to remove it from my townhouse and from my skin. And for a long time the line stayed silent, as if I'd called a dead number. Then Mr. Han answered in a voice that sounded older than it had in the showroom, and he didn't ask why. He didn't negotiate price. He only said, "It chose you," like a man stating whether, and when I insisted I would bring it back anyway, he paused and said something that made my blood run cold. "If you move it, it will move you. and the call ended with a soft click that sounded less like a phone disconnect and more like a ceremonial seal being pressed. And after that, my palm began burning in earnest. Not sharp pain, but a steady heat along the ink-stained creases as if the lines were being rewritten. And I stared at my hand under bright bathroom light and saw that the stain had deepened into actual characters, now thin strokes embedded in my skin. Forming writing I couldn't read, yet instinctively recognized as mine. A name being transcribed into an ancient ledger format, and panic made me reckless. Because I grabbed a blade from my shaving kit and tried scraping at the ink as if it were dirt, cutting at my skin in frantic shallow lines. But the blood that appeared was bright and ordinary, and the ink remained beneath it. Immune, as if my flesh were only paper and the writing was written on the bone. And I stumbled into the upstairs study and threw the cloth off the glass cabinet and stared at the statue as if glaring hard enough could unmake it. And the statue's face looked exactly as it always had, serene, modest, lips parted, as if holding a gentle breath. Yet now I saw the full cruelty of that expression, because serenity on a judge's face is not kindness, it's certainty. And the cabinet glass fogged slowly from the inside, and the smooth voice slid into my skull with intimate calm. "You are afraid of justice." And I shouted aloud that this wasn't justice. This was slaughter dressed as elegance. And the room's temperature dropped in response, the kind of cold that makes wood contract and glass creak, and the sobbing chorus rose behind the voice. Not loud like a wail, but steady, like a crowd murmuring agreement. And I realized with awful clarity that the deity didn't care about my moral argument, because I wasn't its equal. I was its instrument. So I changed tactics, pleading instead, offering money, offering museums, offering public reverence, telling it I would build a shrine, I would fund research, I would restore temples, I would do anything if it would stop using people's bodies as corrections. And for a moment, the study fell silent enough that my hopes surged. But then the voice replied with the simplest dismissal. "You misunderstand, this is not correction. This is release." And the phrase made my throat tighten, because release sounded holy, sounded merciful. Yet it carried the chill of something removing obstacles. And suddenly I understood the sobs I'd been hearing all these nights weren't merely complaints. They were a reservoir, a 1,000-year pressure trapped inside a beautiful vessel. And each time the deity crushed a rival, it wasn't punishing them personally. It was venting, expelling, emptying the reservoir through violence disguised as balance. And that meant the end goal was not my business success. The end goal was to empty itself entirely, every grievance, every wronged breath, until nothing remained inside the statue but pure presence, pure divinity freed of suffering. And the horror was that divinity freed of suffering has no empathy left, only power. And I realized then what I truly was. Not a collector, not a patron, not even a host, but a wick, a temporary conduit the deity could burn through until the last bitterness was spent. And once the bitterness was spent, the wick would be discarded. And the moment that realization landed, the closet door in my bedroom slammed upstairs with a heavy thud that shook the house, and the sound of brush on paper intensified as if someone had begun writing faster. And I ran upstairs and yanked the closet open and saw nothing but coats and dark space until the air inside rippled like water and a scent rolled out. Incense so thick it felt chewable, and in that scent I felt the presence of a hall, a court hall, pressing through the closet like it was a doorway. And within that darkness, a pale wooden table seemed to appear only when I wasn't looking directly at it. And on that table sat an open ledger, pages made of lacquered wood, black characters gleaming wetly as if freshly written. And I knew without being told that those pages were being filled with every release, every crushed enemy, every vented grievance. And at the bottom of the newest page was my name, newly inscribed, waiting like a final entry. And I staggered back, heart hammering, because in that instant I understood the statue's final demand. A seal must be closed with blood and breath, and I was the breath. I was the last living breath needed to finish the vow. And I tried to run, of course. I tried to run down the stairs, out the front door, into the street, into any bright public place where gods might hesitate. But the moment I reached the landing, the ink in my palm flared with heat so intense my arm jerked, and my legs buckled as if gravity doubled. And I fell hard onto the carpet, lungs crushed by invisible weight, ribs aching, and in the hallway air I heard the smooth voice not in my skull but in the room itself for the first time. A soundless speaking that bent silence into meaning. Do not flee the offering. And the house lights flickered and my vision tunneled, and I crawled toward the study like a man dragged by an unseen rope. And when I reached the cabinet, my ink-written hand lifted the key from the drawer by itself, because by then I wasn't deciding anything. I was being completed, and the cabinet door opened with a soft, respectful click. And the statue stood there inside velvet like a prince inside a coffin, and I felt the air thicken with all those voices. Thousands of wronged breaths pressing against me as if eager to pour through, and the statue's carved lips looked almost tender, almost grateful. And that false tenderness broke me, because I realized this was how it made people cooperate. It offered beauty as consolation, while it used your body as a drain, and my palm pressed against the statue's sleeve again. And this time, I didn't just feel the ink lines respond. I felt them open, like channels cut in flesh. And through those channels the chorus surged, not into my mind, but through me, pouring down my arm, across my chest, into my lungs, and my breath left my mouth in a long, involuntary exhale that did not feel like air. It felt like centuries, like dust and smoke and courtroom incense finally being released. And as the exhale continued, far longer than human breath should continue, I felt myself hollowing, not dying exactly, but being emptied, my muscles weakening, my vision dimming, my thoughts thinning, and in that draining, I heard the deity's final satisfaction, quiet and absolute. Enough. And the word was not mercy, it was closure. And when the last impossible breath finally stopped, I collapsed to the floor beside the cabinet, chest barely moving. And the house fell into a silence so clean it felt sterilized. And in that silence, the statue in the cabinet looked different, not more alive, not moving, but subtly lighter, as if a shadow had been removed from its beauty. And for a brief, terrible moment, I understood why people worship cruel gods, because their beauty after feeding is incomparable. And the last thing I remember before darkness folded over me was the cabinet glass clearing completely, no fog at all, revealing the statue's face in perfect clarity. And in that clarity, the carved eyes downcast. All this time seemed to lift a fraction. Not physically, but in implication. And the sensation of being looked at by something finally unburdened was so cold it made me want to scream. Because a deity without grievance is not peaceful. It is free. And when I woke, if waking is the right word, I was lying on my gallery floor downstairs with dawn leaking through the curtains. My skin gray with exhaustion, my hands still stained with ink characters that now looked finished, complete, as if my body had become a signed document. And upstairs in the study, the cabinet stood open, velvet empty, the statue gone, leaving behind only a small black brush resting on the velvet base, bristles still wet, and beside it a single sheet of paper, blank except for one line written in perfect black ink. Thank you for hearing them. And as I stared at that line with trembling vision, I realized the most haunting ending of all wasn't that my enemies had been punished. It was that the deity had moved on, released, perfected, unanchored, and somewhere in the city, in another collector's clean bright room, a new glass cabinet would soon fog from the inside, and another person would mistake beauty for ownership until the ledger found their name, the meat that shouts. London at night has its own flavor, and anyone who says otherwise has never stood alone in a professional kitchen at 140A, with the extractor fans humming like distant storms and the city's rain tapping the back door and patient little nails. Because after the last diners leave and the front lights dim, the restaurant stops being a place that serves comfort and becomes what it truly is, a temple of heat, steel, hunger, and knives. And that is where I lived most of my adult life. Inside stainless steel reflections, inside the ritual of wiping down surfaces, resetting stations, sharpening blades until they sing, because routine is the only thing that makes you feel clean in a world that deals in flesh. And my name is Elliot Grange, head chef at a Mayfair restaurant called the Wren and Brass, and I had built my reputation on one stubborn principle: if you respect an ingredient enough, It will confess its best self to you. It will bloom under salt and flame. It will become meaning. And that principle made my hands famous and my life lonely. But I didn't mind loneliness because loneliness is quiet. And quiet is something you learn to crave when your days are filled with shouting tickets and clattering pans and the relentless, intimate violence of chopping things into smaller things. So when the call came from my supplier, an old friend named Marek, who had connections that most chefs only whispered about, I answered half distracted, still wearing my apron, still smelling of shallots and smoke, and Marek said he had something so rare it won't last a day on the market. Something organic, heritage bred, raised like royalty. And in that moment, my tired brain lit up the way it always does when excellence is dangled in front of it, because excellence is my addiction. And Marek told me it was a whole loin of Mangalica pork from a private farm outside the city where the owner treated pigs like sacred animals, feed regulated, slaughter overseen with an almost religious care. And I remember laughing softly and saying, pork doesn't need religion, it needs technique. But Marek didn't laugh back. He only paused and said, just don't waste it. And the way he said waste made the word sound like sin. And I should have noticed that. I should have asked why his voice sounded like a man handing over a dangerous heirloom. But desire makes you careless. So I agreed. And 2 hours later, while rain streaked the alley behind the restaurant and the streets were empty enough to make the city feel abandoned, Marek's van pulled up and he carried in a cooler box sealed with thick white tape. No label, no branding, just a black marker line across the lid like a slash. And he wouldn't step into the kitchen fully, wouldn't cross the threshold past the back door, as if the heat and smell of food offended him. And he told me the meat had to stay cold, had to be used soon, had to be respected. And I rolled my eyes because suppliers love drama. And then he said the second strange thing. If you see writing, he murmured, pretend you didn't. Then I blinked, unsure I'd heard correctly over the extractor fans, and I asked what he meant. But Marek was already backing away, rain beating on his jacket, refusing my gaze, and he left without taking the tea I offered, like he was afraid to share anything with me beyond the object itself. And when the back door shut and the kitchen fell into its familiar late-night hum, I stood over the cooler box and felt a faint pressure in my chest. The primitive sense that something inside my walls had changed, yet I did what chefs do when faced with mystery. I opened the box, because curiosity is our most dangerous seasoning, and the first thing that hit me wasn't smell good. Meat doesn't smell much. It was the look of it. Pale pink flesh with fat marbling like soft snowfall, beautiful in the clinical way only butchers and surgeons truly appreciate. A perfect cut, the kind of ingredient that makes a chef feel chosen, and I felt that old thrill, that greedy gratitude. And I carried it to the prep table beneath bright lights, laying it on clean paper, reaching for my boning knife, and this is where the story becomes difficult to explain without sounding insane. Because nothing supernatural announced itself at first. No phantom wind, no whisper, no shadow in the corner, only the familiar click of my blade against the steel as I tested the edge, the smell of disinfectant on my hands, the quiet of a kitchen that has finally stopped performing. And I began trimming with the practiced care of a man who has broken down 1,000 animals, sliding the knife along the seam of fat, lifting silver skin, removing what would tighten under heat. And as I worked, I noticed faint striations in the muscle fibers. Normal, yes, but also patterned, because muscle grain usually runs like wind through grass. It has direction but not intention, yet here the fibers seem to align in tiny repeating arcs, little ridges that converged and split as if guided. And I leaned closer, squinting under the harsh light, telling myself it was a trick of fatigue, a coincidence of marbling. And then I saw the first clear shape, a line crossing another line at a hard angle, too precise to be organic, and beneath it, a curved hook, like a letter, not English, not Latin, something older like a stamp of meaning pressed into flesh, and my scalp prickled, because my mind, trained to recognize patterns in plating and pastry and knife cuts, immediately recognized this wasn't random. It was language, and the absurdity of that made me laugh, once, short and dry, like a man laughing at a horror film. Yet my hands kept moving as if my body refused to share my disbelief. And the more I trimmed, the more shapes emerged, not drawn on the surface but formed by the very alignment of fibers, as if the meat had grown around a script, as if some invisible hand had written inside the animal long before the slaughter. And I thought of Merrick's warning. If you see writing, pretend you didn't, and the memory made my stomach tighten, and I did the next sensible thing. I tried to flip the cut to find a clean side, to escape the pattern, but when I turned it, the underside had the same structures, deeper now, more legible, multiple characters lined in a subtle row, and for a moment I felt a dizzy kind of vertigo, because the kitchen lights glared, the extractor fans roared softly, and the world narrowed to a slab of beautiful pork, holding a message that didn't belong in any living tissue. And in that moment, without choosing to, I whispered, no, not to anyone, not to the meat even, but to the idea that this could be happening in my spotless Mayfair kitchen. And the whisper seemed to change the air, because the temperature dropped a fraction, not enough to be cold, but enough to make the sweat on my neck feel unpleasant. And the meat, this is the detail that still makes my jaw lock seem to tense. Not physically like a muscle twitch, but visually, like the fibers had drawn themselves tighter, the characters becoming slightly clearer, and I stepped back hard enough that my knee bumped the cabinet, and the sound echoed too loudly. And at that exact second, the kitchen scent changed, not gradually like food shifts, but instantly, like a light turning. The clean smell of raw meat being replaced by something sour and wrong, a faint rot note like damp cardboard left in a basement, and I froze, knife held midair. Because rot doesn't appear in fresh pork within seconds, rot doesn't manifest like a decision, and my brain tried to argue it away. Garbage bin, drain trap, something expired nearby, but the smell centered on the prep table, on the cut itself, and it grew stronger with every breath until my eyes watered. And then I heard the sound that truly broke me, because smell can be imagined, patterns can be misread, but sound is harder to excuse. A tiny noise, very small, almost like air bubbling through hot oil, except there was no heat yet, no pan, no stove, just raw flesh on paper, and the noise was coming from inside the meat, a faint wet clicking like teeth tapped together. And when I leaned in, despite my fear, the clicking became a soft tremor of sound that resembled, God help me, an almost human murmur, a threadbare groan buried under fibers, and my throat tightened, because the brain recognizes suffering before it recognizes meaning. And in that murmur I felt, not heard, the suggestion of a word pressed through something that didn't have lungs anymore, and I jerked away, heart hammering, the knife clattering onto the table, and in the sudden silence that followed, the extractor fan seemed to grow louder, like the kitchen was trying to drown out what I'd heard. And I did what I never do. I retreated, backing away from my station as if it were a live animal, as if the pork could leap, and I told myself I would throw it out, call Merrick, report him, do anything to remove it from my building. But when I reached for the cooler box, my hand hesitated, because the chef's curse is pride. You don't waste rare ingredients. You don't discard perfection. You don't admit fear in front of food. And that hesitation was the moment the object won, because as my fingers hovered above the cooler lid, I heard the murmur again from the meat, clearer now, like a throat learning its own voice, and the smell of rot flared so strong it made my stomach roll, and at the same time, horribly, seductively, another scent appeared beneath it, a faint sweetness, like warm fat beginning to render, like the promise of flavor trying to persuade me, and I understood in a flash that this thing was not only cursed, it was manipulative, wearing culinary temptation like perfume. And that realization sparked anger, because anger is easier than terror. So I marched back to the prep table, grabbed the knife, and decided the only way to regain control was to do what I always do: cook the truth out of it, sear it until whatever nonsense was inside it had to reveal itself under heat, because heat is honest. Heat doesn't negotiate, and I told myself that with a certainty that felt like a prayer as I fired the range, set a heavy pan on flame, poured in oil, and waited until the surface shimmered. And in that waiting, The meat sat quietly, as if calm again, as if the voices had only been my imagination, as if it were merely pork. And I nearly believed it until I noticed the characters in the fibers subtly shifting, not moving like worms, not writhing, but aligning more perfectly, forming a clearer line of text like a message preparing to be read. And my fingers tightened on the tongs, and when I lifted the cut from the paper, it felt heavier than it should have, not in weight, but in implication, like lifting an object that doesn't belong to you. And as I lowered it into the pan, the oil should have hissed with that clean, appetizing sound, but instead the pan made a noise like a low, offended sigh, and the moment flesh touched heat, the smell of rot exploded into the kitchen like a door flung open on a morgue. Thick and wet and undeniable. A smell that didn't belong to food at any stage, and my stomach lurched. My eyes stung, and then beneath the hiss and sizzle came that sound again, amplified, not loud but clearer. A tiny chorus of groans, as if the meat had always contained a throat, and now the heat had squeezed it into speech, and I stood frozen at the stove, sweat chilling on my back, listening to something in my pan quietly suffer. And in that suffering I felt the weight of a principle I'd never believed before. Some evils do not die, they only change form, and if what Merrick had delivered to me was not just pork, but punishment, then my kitchen had become the next mouth in a very old sentence, and I realized, too late, that I had already begun to chew. I should have killed the flame the moment that stink hit my nostrils. I should have dumped the whole cut into the bin behind the restaurant and poured bleach after it like holy water. But pride is a cruel god in kitchens, and I had worshipped it too long. So instead, I stood there, breathing through my mouth, eyes watering, gripping the tongs as the pork seared and the pan filled with that obscene, sweet, rotten haze, and the sound beneath the sizzle did not fade the way imagined noises fade. When you force yourself to blink and act normal, it persisted, steady and small. Like a radio left on low volume in another room, the tiniest moan threaded through the oil's hiss, and once I accepted it was real enough to hear, I began hearing more than moans. Because the human brain is a pattern machine. It will turn static into words if you stare at it long enough. And the kitchen, at 2 a.m., is nothing but static fans, compressors, distant traffic, rain. So my mind did what minds do. It translated. And the groans in the pan started taking shape as syllables, not English, not anything I had ever spoken. Yet, meaning arrived anyway, like a taste on the tongue. Bitter and metallic. And with every flip of the meat, I felt those meanings sharpen, as if heat didn't just cook flesh, it cooked the message into readability, and I found myself leaning closer to the pan, against all instincts, listening the way you listen at a hospital door, the way you listen when you suspect your name is being said somewhere you can't see, and the words that formed were not prayers or curses but accusations wronged, framed, sold, devoured ideas so ancient they carried the dust of dynasties. And then the most horrifying detail surfaced, not in language but sensation, hunger. Because the cut in my pan was not simply suffering, it was hungry in a way that had nothing to do with food, hungry the way a verdict is hungry for a throat. And I felt that hunger as a pressure behind my sternum, a tightening that made my own mouth water involuntarily, the worst betrayal of all, my body responding like a chef to a dish that should have disgusted me. And when I finally pulled the meat from the pan to rest, it looked beautiful in the light golden crust. Perfect caramelization like any other premium pork I'd ever served, except the letters and the fibers had become more visible, darkened by sear into crisp strokes like ink baked onto parchment. And as it rested, the groans faded into a faint trembling hum that seemed to vibrate up through the cutting board and into my wrists. And I told myself I would not eat it. I told myself that out loud, as if the kitchen might hold me accountable. But the problem with a private kitchen at night is that it encourages experiments. And chefs live on experiments, so I did what I will regret, as long as I have a tongue. I sliced a thin piece from the end, just to test, just to confirm, just to end the uncertainty, and the knife slid through with a softness too, yielding, the interior pale and glossy, and as the blade passed, the letters in the grain seemed to align again, forming a tighter line, as if the meat was trying to speak through the cut itself. And when I lifted the slice to my nose, The rot smell should have been strongest there, but it wasn't. Instead, the slice smelled faintly sweet, almost floral, like rendered fat mixed with something medicinal and old. And that contradiction, beauty layered over decay, made my stomach flip because it felt deliberate, like bait. And I did not swallow the piece, not fully. I only let it touch my tongue, and the moment it did, my entire mouth flooded with a taste that did not belong to pork or seasoning. A taste like damp stone and incense ash and cold iron. And behind that taste came the sensation of voices. Not heard, but felt. Like thousands of mouths whispering directly into my taste buds. And I jerked back so hard the slice fell onto the cutting board. Yet the taste remained, clinging to my tongue like grease. And then the kitchen lights flickered. Once. Just once. And in that flicker I saw, in the reflection of the stainless prep counter, a figure behind me. Not a chef, or a dishwasher, or a thief, but a thin outline of a man kneeling with his hands bound, head bowed. And before I could fully register it, the light steadied, and the reflection was only my own pale face, sweat sheened, eyes bloodshot, and I laughed in disbelief again, the sharp, dry laugh of a man watching his own sanity slip. And I reached for my water bottle and drank. But the water tasted like old paper, and my throat tightened, as if it wanted to refuse everything I consumed from that moment forward. And that is when my phone buzzed with a notification from Marek. No greeting, no explanation, just a single line. Do not serve it. And I stared at the message with my heart hammering because it arrived too late, like a warning shouted after the cliff edge. And I typed back furious questions. What is this? What did you give me? Why is it making noise? But Marek did not reply, and as if the silence were an answer, the cut on the board gave a faint twitch. Not movement, not muscle contraction, just the slightest tightening of fibers, and the letters in the grain darkened to shade. And I suddenly understood something that should have been obvious. The message wasn't meant for me to read with my eyes. It was meant to be delivered through appetite, through consumption. Because kitchens are temples where desire becomes action. And the thing in the pork wanted a mouth, wanted heat, wanted teeth, and I had given it all three, and the terror of that thought pushed me into action at last, because I grabbed the cut with tongs and rushed toward the back door to throw it away, to remove it from my building. But the moment I reached the alley, rain cold on my cheeks, bin lids clattering in the wind, the rot smell intensified so violently it made me gag, and the meat and the tongs began emitting a tiny rhythmic sound like a whispering laugh. And I flung it into the bin, slammed the lid, and stepped back, shaking, breathing hard in the wet night air, telling myself it was over. Yet as I stood there, the alley's puddles reflecting sodium streetlight, I heard a second sound from inside the bin, a soft, wet knocking, patient, like someone tapping from inside a coffin. And the realization hit me with ice clarity. You cannot dispose of a punishment by moving it to a different container. You can only pass it along. And that is exactly what the curse wanted, because the next morning, when I arrived back at the Wren and Brass trying to pretend my hands were steady, the news was already whispering through staff phones like grease fire. A rival chef from Knightsbridge, Gareth Rook, a man known for crushing juniors and buying his awards, had collapsed in his own kitchen during service, not from a knife, not from heat, but from something the paramedics called sudden thoracic compression. His ribs bruised as if squeezed by invisible hands, his breath stolen without smoke, and the rumor among chefs was that he'd been prepping a special pork dish, sourced through an anonymous drop. And when I heard that, my knees nearly buckled, because in my mind, I saw the bin lid, the wet knocking, the patient hunger, and I understood the shape of the cruelty. The meat didn't scream because it was dying, it screamed because it was remembering. And the world was forcing that memory to be eaten again and again under different knives, different flames, different teeth, until the one who deserved it was finally chewed into nothing. And as that thought settled into me, sour and heavy, I realized my horror wasn't only that I had touched the curse, it was that a part of me, small, shameful, chef-proud, was relieved I hadn't served it to my own guests, because it meant the punishment was moving outward instead of inward. And in that relief I heard, faintly, beneath the kitchen's ordinary hum, the smallest new sound rising like a whisper under oil. Not a moan this time, not a plea, but a satisfied little murmur, as if somewhere inside the building, something had found its next mouth. After Gareth Rook collapsed, the whole London chef scene behaved the way it does when fire breaks out in a kitchen you don't work in. Everyone pretended they weren't frightened, while secretly checking their own gas lines, their own knives, their own suppliers, because chefs are trained to believe misfortune is always mechanical, always human error, always explainable, and anything else. The idea of punishment that travels through food threatens the one lie we need to survive, that we're in control of what we put in mouths. And for a day or two I tried to cling to that lie myself, burying my night in the bin behind the restaurant, under prep lists and service notes, telling myself it was coincidence that Gareth had touched special pork, telling myself Merrick's text was just supplier paranoia, telling myself my mind had turned fatigue into hallucination and London gossip into a myth. But obsession isn't something you can simply schedule around. Obsession behaves like hunger, and once that taste of incense ash and cold iron had touched my tongue, my body didn't forget it the way it forgets a bad wine. It remembered it the way it remembers a burn, and I began to notice how the kitchen itself was changing around me, not in decor or staff, but in sound and smell, because there were moments, tiny, almost plausible moments, where the extractor fan's hum seemed to form syllables, where the sizzle of oil seemed to mimic breath, where the drain's gurgle sounded less like plumbing and more like throat clearing. And every time those moments happened, the hair on my arms rose and my mouth went dry, as if my body had learned to fear its own workplace. And the worst part was that the more afraid I became, the sharper my senses got. And sharpened senses in a kitchen are a curse, because you start hearing the world in ingredients. You start tasting moral rot in meat. You start smelling lies and steam. And so I began doing what chefs do when they sense contamination. I investigated my supply chain like it was a crime scene, calling Merrick again and again until his line finally rang out to voicemail, driving after service to the warehouse district where his van's usually loaded, only to find his unit shuttered, padlocked, the metal door painted over with fresh gray paint as if someone wanted to erase it quickly. And that quick erasure terrified me more than any ghost, because ghosts don't paint over evidence. People do, and it meant Marek had either fled or been silenced, and that opened a new possibility that twisted my stomach. The curse wasn't an isolated relic. It had handlers, it had couriers, it had a route like contraband, and the route ran through kitchens, and once I accepted that, my mind began connecting dots like knives, and I thought about all the myths of cursed objects hidden in luxury goods, about old punishments designed to outlive their victims, about the idea that evil men never truly die, but are recycled into something edible so the world can keep devouring them forever. And in the days that followed, more chefs suffered not gruesome deaths, not gore, but a particular repeating symptom, breath stolen as if by invisible pressure, rib pain without impact, collapse mid-service with eyes wide like they were watching something pressed down from above. And in each case, the gossip thread included a meat drop, an unlabeled cooler, a heritage pork, a dealer who refused to step across the back door threshold. And each time I heard the pattern tighten, my sense of guilt tightened too, because the first kitchen had been mine, the first pan had been mine, the first mouth to taste the curse had been mine, and if the curse had a scent, a signature, then I had already signed for delivery. So I began losing sleep and appetite in equal measure, because I couldn't bear the idea of eating ordinary food anymore. Every sausage looked suspicious, every roast smelled faintly wrong, every bit of fat and broth made me think of letters hidden in muscle grain. And I started chewing gum constantly just to keep my mouth busy without swallowing anything meaningful, and that nervous compulsion only worsened the sensation that the curse was using my senses as instruments. Because one night, standing in the walk-in fridge alone with the cold blasting my skin and the blue light turning everything corpse-like, I heard it clearly for the first time outside the pan. A tiny groan from inside the chill itself, as if the sound had learned to travel through temperature, and my spine went cold because I realized what I'd feared all along. The curse hadn't left my building. When I threw that cutaway, it had only changed how it moved. And the proof came the next morning when my sous chef, Nisha, walked in looking pale and said there'd been a delivery error overnight, a cooler box left by the back door with no invoice. And the moment she said cooler box, my blood turned to ice, because the universe does not repeat accidents unless it's teaching you something, and I told her not to touch it. I told her in a voice too sharp to be normal, and I ran to the alley myself, rain misting in the air, and there it was, a familiar white box sealed with thick tape, a black marker slash across the lid, placed neatly like a gift. And as I approached it, the rot smell wasn't present yet, not fully, but the air was wrong, charged and stale like a room that's been held shut too long. And when I bent close, I heard, faint as a mosquito, the softest sound of tapping from inside, patient as a heart. And I didn't open it. I didn't dare. Yet my hand shook with that same kitchen pride instinct, the desire to control the ingredient, to see what I'm dealing with. And my whole body felt like it was split between disgust and compulsion. And the split was the point, because curses don't force you like chains. They tempt you like habits. So I dragged the cooler into the kitchen, locked the back door behind me, and carried it into the prep area as if it were a bomb. And under the bright lights, I stared at it for a long time without touching the tape. And then my phone buzzed, not a message, a voice call from an unknown number. And when I answered, expecting silence, I heard Merrick's voice, barely audible beneath static, breathy, as if he was calling from a tunnel. And he said, "Elliot, don't answer it." And my throat tightened as I demanded where he was, what this was, why it had come back. And he made a small broken sound, like a man trying not to sob, then whispered, "It remembers the first pan." And I froze because that single sentence felt like truth. And Marek continued, voice trembling, "It needs the first mouth to finish the sentence." And when I asked what sentence, the line crackled and the static swelled. And in that static, I heard the tiniest chorus of groans, as if the curse had hijacked the call. And then the call ended, and I stood there shaking in my silent kitchen, with a cooler box at my feet that had returned like a debt. And I understood the cruel genius of it. The punishment didn't simply travel randomly until it found its target. It moved until it found the person who had awakened it, because awakening creates responsibility, and responsibility creates vulnerability. And now, the curse wasn't satisfied with crushing the worst men in the industry. It had circled back for the one man who had provided heat and attention, the one man who had heard it. And as that understanding settled into my bones, my stomach lurched with a sudden wave of nausea that tasted like incense, ash, and I realized with dread that the curse had already begun writing inside me. Because when I looked down at my hands, the faintest gray smear marked the crease of my thumb like soot, and I scrubbed at it, but it didn't fully go away. And beneath the extractor fan's hum, beneath the fridge compressor's low drone, I heard something new, tiny, satisfied, almost playful, as if the meat, wherever it was in that box, had begun to practice my name, in a voice too small for anyone else to hear. I did not open the cooler box immediately, not because I had regained self-control, but because I was terrified that if I looked at the meat again, I would understand it too well. And understanding is the first step toward acceptance. So instead, I treated it like a biohazard, like a chemical spill, with a hunger. I wrapped the entire box in black bin liners, double knotted them, hauled it into the walk-in fridge, shoved it onto the bottom shelf behind crates of vegetables, like hiding it behind innocence would blunt its intent. Then I taped a handwritten sign to the door, "Do not touch," like a desperate priest scrawling words on a chapel wall. And for a few hours, I managed to pretend the kitchen belonged to normal things again. Normal knives, normal flames, normal flesh that doesn't speak. Yet the pretense couldn't survive the day because the curse had already re-entered my sense world, and my body began reacting like it was being tuned to it. The faint soot smear in the crease of my thumb darkening as afternoon dragged on, lines appearing in my skin that looked too straight to be ordinary grime. And every time I washed my hands, which is to say every 10 minutes, because chefs wash the way anxious people blink, the markings would soften but never fully disappear, as if the ink wasn't on my skin anymore but beneath it. And while service ramped up downstairs, the dining room filling with laughter and clinking glass and money. I stood over my pass, watching plates go out, and felt like a fraud presiding over a religion I no longer believed in, because food had stopped being comfort and become conduit, and the real horror was how the curse altered my palate. I would taste rot beneath beer blanc. I would smell damp earth and rosemary. I would hear the faintest groan hiding under the sizzle of scallops, and I kept turning my head sharply, expecting to catch a voice in the corner. But it was always within the ordinary sounds of a kitchen oil, steam, metal like the curse had learned to piggyback on routine. And that is what finally broke my resistance, because near the end of service, at 10:58 p.m., when the last mains were leaving the pass, the walk-in fridge alarm chirped once, a soft warning beep that usually means someone didn't close the door properly, and my stomach dropped because I knew I had closed it. I knew it like you locked your front door after hearing about a burglary. And I walked toward the fridge with my chef's jacket sticking to my back in sweat and the smell of roast duck clinging to my sleeves. And the closer I got, the colder the corridor felt. Not simply refrigerated air, but the stale cold of sealed spaces. And when I reached the fridge door, I saw it was cracked open by a finger's width, just enough to leak a thin blade of bluish light, and the handwritten sign I'd taped there had been altered. Something had added a second line beneath my warning, written in faint gray smears, like ash on damp glass. The letters, uneven, but unmistakable. You touched first, and for a moment I couldn't breathe, because that sentence was both accusation and claim, the kind of thing an abuser says when you try to leave. And I shoved the fridge door open hard enough that crates rattled inside. The cold air slammed into my face. And there, on the bottom shelf, where I'd hidden the wrapped box, the bin liners had been split open from inside in clean tearing lines, and the cooler lid now sat slightly ajar. Tape peeled back like a peeled mouth, and in that cold blue light I heard the sound again. Not sizzling now, not oil hiss, but a tiny wet murmur, a threadbare groan that seemed to vibrate through the fridge shelves, and the smell of rot rolled out as if the box had exhaled, thick and sweet and corpse-wrong. So strong it made my eyes sting, and I should have slammed the door and run. But something inside me, the chef, the proud idiot, the man who thinks he can master any ingredient, stepped forward, and I lifted the lid with shaking hands. And the sight beneath it made my stomach go hollow in a way fear usually does. A new cut of pork lay inside, larger than the first, pale as candle wax, with marbling like delicate calligraphy, and the letters were no longer subtle. They were obvious, arranged in long lines across the flesh as if the animal had been grown as a page. And the script wasn't just random characters either. It looked like an alphabet repeating strokes, structured patterns, meaning the curse was teaching itself how to be read, how to be spoken. And as I stared, my brain translated nothing consciously, yet my mouth began forming silent shapes involuntarily, like a child mouthing words while learning to read. And the tiny groans in the meat rose in intensity as if pleased by my attention. And then the most disgusting, intimate sensation arrived. The meat smelled simultaneously rotten and appetizing, a nauseating blend of decay and roasted sweetness that made my saliva glands betray me. Because it wasn't trying to repel me anymore, it was trying to hook me. And in that moment, I understood the deeper mechanism. The curse didn't need to be eaten by anyone. It needed to be wanted by someone. It needed desire as fuel, and it had chosen me because chefs are trained to desire ingredients with a religious intensity. And as I stood there with cold air burning my lungs, the refrigerator's hum seemed to drop in pitch until it resembled a voice. And within that humming I heard a phrase not in English, but the meaning landed fully formed in my mind like a stamped verdict. Traitor. And with the word came a surge of images so sharp I had to grip the shelf to stay standing. An ancient banquet hall, officials laughing, while a kneeling man begged. Ink-stained documents, a butcher block, a body forced into meat, teeth chewing, a promise that the traitor would be consumed forever by other mouths, never dying, only transforming so that each life he lived, he would eventually be eaten again. And when I stumbled back from the cooler, the fridge door swung wider behind me as if pushed, and in the stainless reflection of the corridor I saw, for one sick instant, a figure, standing just behind my shoulder. Not a ghost in a sheet, but a man in old robes, with a face too calm, too smug, his hands clasped like a court official satisfied with his own betrayal, and my skin flashed cold, because I understood the curse wasn't punishing some anonymous evil. It was punishing a specific kind of evil, cold, bureaucratic cruelty that hides behind law and procedure. An evil that has lived many lives, always thriving, and now reduced to pork, and the figure's expression felt like laughter without sound. And my throat tightened with disgust because I realized why the meat shouted. It wasn't screaming for help, it was screaming because it remembered being powerful, and humiliation is its own kind of agony. And then the butcher's alphabet began to shift, the letters and the fibers darkening and aligning more rapidly as if the meat were being written in real time. And among those strokes I saw something that made my hands shake harder. My name. Not printed in neat Latin letters, but spelled out through the old character's phonetic logic. A private translation made for me, and I staggered back, whispering no, because a curse that knows your name is no longer a random phenomenon. It's a relationship. And relationships are how things enter your life permanently. And beneath the fridge hum, I heard the tiniest new sound, almost tender, like a child learning to speak. The meat practicing the syllables of Elliot. Elliot, in wet little murmurs. And the horror of that pushed me into my next terrible decision. If it had learned my name, then it had learned my kitchen, my habits, my weaknesses. And the only way to stop it from using my heat again was to remove it from the place that gives it voice. So I slammed the cooler shut, wrapped it again as fast as my shaking hands could, dragged it out of the walk-in fridge, and hauled it toward the kitchen's hottest heart, the range, because if it wanted flame, I would give it flame on my terms, not as cuisine, not as service, but as cremation. And while the dining room upstairs glowed with polite laughter and dessert spoons clinked in ignorance, I stood alone under extractor fan roar, lit every burner, set the largest stock pot on the highest flame, poured in alcohol, and watched the blue fire dance hungrily. And as the heat rose, the cooler box on the floor began knocking softly from within like something trapped. And the groans grew louder, not loud enough for staff to hear above service, but loud enough that I felt them under my teeth. And I realized as I lifted the lid again that I wasn't just fighting a cursed ingredient anymore. I was standing at the border between appetite and punishment, and on the far side of that border, something ancient was smiling, waiting to see whether I would finally become the mouth it had trained me to be. I have cooked my whole life with the belief that fire purifies, that heat turns danger into nourishment and rawness into something safe enough to serve to strangers. But that night in the Wren and Brass, I learned the darker truth. Fire doesn't purify everything. Sometimes it only makes the hidden voice louder. And when I lifted the cooler lid beside the roaring range, the smell that surged out wasn't just rot anymore. It was rot mixed with the sweet, seductive perfume of rendered fat, like a corpse wearing perfume to tempt you closer. And my stomach lurched so hard I tasted bile. Yet my hands moved anyway, because the curse had trained me through my instincts, chef instincts, to believe that if I could just apply the right technique, the right temperature, the right timing, that I could control it. And control is the chef's addiction. So I seized the cut with tongs and dropped it into the stock pot of flaming alcohol like a man feeding something to a furnace. And the liquid erupted into blue fire that licked the meat's surface. And the sound that came from the pot was not the clean, excited hiss of flambe, but a wet, anguished chorus. Thousands of tiny groans compressed into one sustained vibration that made my skin ripple, and I slammed the lid on the pot to smother the flames. But the lid rattled violently as if something inside were struggling. And from the seam where lid met steel, a thin gray vapor began to leak, not smoke, not steam, but something that carried smell and meaning. Incense and courthouse dust. And the vapor curled upward like a living ribbon, shaping itself into faint characters in the air, strokes that held their form for a second before dissolving. And I stared at those drifting letters with terror, because it meant the curse could travel without meat now. It could become breath. And then, with a sudden violent clank, the stockpot lid lifted a fraction by itself and slammed back down as if something within had pushed against it. And I heard clearer than I had ever heard it, the trader's voice. Not a moan, not a murmur, but a thin, breathy laugh, the sound of smugness that has survived execution. and beneath that laugh, the refrigerator compressor's hum dropped into a resonance that seemed to speak in a language older than London's streets, and my head filled with images again. A minister signing false charges, a loyal man executed, a nation betrayed, and then the minister, my smug reflection figure smiling as if betrayal were cleverness. And the punishment that followed wasn't simply death. It was reduction into meat, into commodity, into the lowest thing in a kitchen hierarchy, to be cut and salted and swallowed forever. And I understood then why the curse had come back to my kitchen, even after I threw the first cut away, because I wasn't just the first pan, I was the first person to listen, and listening is how you become implicated. So the deity of punishment had tightened the loop until it reached the only mouth that mattered, the one that could understand it, and the lid rattled again, harder, and the sound under it shifted into something more articulate, syllables rising like bubbles, and my own mouth began forming them without consent, lips moving in time with the pot's vibration as if my body were being used as a translator. And suddenly I realized what the curse truly demanded. It didn't want to be destroyed. It wanted to be finished. Because punishments built to last for centuries still need closure, an ending ritual, a final act where the traitor is not merely recycled into meat again, but finally named and consumed by someone who understands the full weight of what they're chewing. A witness eater, an executioner with a palate. And the horror was that the curse had chosen a chef, precisely because chefs are professionals at making people consume without thinking, meaning I was trained to be its perfect final instrument. And that is the moment my pride collapsed into nausea, because I saw myself not as a man battling evil, but as a man being groomed to serve it. And I did the only act of defiance left. I called the police, yes, the police, absurd as it sounds, because I needed another human presence, another set of eyes, another witness who could ground me in ordinary reality. And when the operator answered, I tried to speak calmly, saying there was an intruder, a hazardous delivery, a safety issue, any lie that would bring bodies to my building fast. But the moment I described a package, my tongue thickened, my throat tightened, and the words wouldn't form, as if an invisible hand pressed down on my larynx, and the traitor's thin laugh escaped from my mouth instead of my own voice, startling me so violently I dropped the phone, and it clattered across tiles, the call still open, the operator saying hello, hello in rising confusion, and then the line filled with the faintest chorus of groans carried through my kitchen's air, like the curse had poured itself into the call, and the operator's voice faltered and cut off, and I understood with ice clarity. This thing didn't want witnesses who didn't understand. It wanted only me. And the lid on the stock pot lifted again, higher this time, and the smell that burst out was so foul I gagged. Yet beneath it came that sickly sweet roast scent again, and I felt my body respond with saliva like an animal despite disgust, because hunger's primal and curses love primal systems, and I backed away from the pot, hands raised like I was surrendering, whispering no. But my feet wouldn't retreat smoothly. The tiles felt thicker, heavier, like gravity had increased in the kitchen's hottest center, and the pressure on my chest, the same compression that had collapsed. Gareth and others began tightening, squeezing my ribs as if invisible hands were testing my durability, and I realized then how the curse punishes those who resist. It doesn't strike with lightning. It squeezes your breath until your mouth does whatever it must to earn air again. And my vision narrowed, my lungs burning, and in that panic I stumbled forward and tore the lid off the pot fully, desperate to release pressure. And inside, the meat was no longer just meat. It had blackened in patches, but the letters remained, glowing faintly like embers in muscle fibers, and they were arranged now in a perfect sentence, and though I could not read the script with my eyes, I could read it with my teeth, with my tongue, with the ancient shame that poured from it, because it was a confession, a full confession of betrayal stamped into pork, and as I stared at it I heard the traitor's voice again, no longer smug, now frantic whispering through steam. I didn't mean it. I didn't mean it. And the repetition made my skin crawl, because it sounded exactly like a coward pleading after the damage is done. And in that moment I felt a second presence in the kitchen, not the traitor, but something colder behind him. A force like law without mercy, like a judge who has waited lifetimes for the correct verdict to be carried out. And that presence did not speak in words. It spoke in inevitability, and the pressure on my chest increased until my knees buckled, and I understood. Either I finish the sentence, or I become part of it. Either I consume the traitor's confession and complete the punishment, or the curse will keep cycling through kitchens, crushing men and women who touch it, forever searching for closure. And that thought, a terrible utilitarian thought, made my brain spit out a solution that felt like blasphemy. I would end it here, even if it meant violating every instinct I had about food safety and sanity. Because ending a curse is sometimes just choosing the least cruel path. So with trembling hands, I fished the blackened cut from the pot and placed it onto a clean board, steam rising like breath, and the groans quieted instantly as if the meat had been waiting for a plate. And in that quiet, my own breathing returned slightly, enough to think, enough to act, and I sliced a small piece, small, manageable, to a token, my knife hand steady only because years of repetition overrode fear. And as the blade cut through, the letters and the fibers seemed to align into a single character on the slice's face, a stamp. And when I lifted it toward my mouth, my whole body recoiled. Yet my lungs ached so badly I needed air, and I realized the curse had engineered that too. It would make eating feel like relief. And that was the final cruelty. So I whispered an apology to every soul I'd ever fed, then put the slice on my tongue. And the taste hit like a courtroom door slamming. Incense ash, and cold iron and damp paper and old fear. And then the words inside it exploded into my mind, the full confession flooding my senses. And I saw the traitor not as a smug official, but as a small, terrified man, hands shaking, signing a death order for a loyal general because his own status was threatened, and I felt his selfishness like a stain. And I hated him with a clean, bright hatred I had never felt for any rival chef, because this was not business cruelty. This was historical cruelty. And as I swallowed, God forgive me, the meat's tiny groans surged once more. But this time they were not pleading. They were releasing, like a breath finally allowed to leave a crushed chest. And the pressure on my ribs eased abruptly, my lungs flooding with air so sharply I sobbed. And the kitchen lights flared bright, and the extractor fan's hum rose back to normal pitch, and the rot smell vanished as if sucked away, leaving only the ordinary scent of hot fat and scorched alcohol. And I dropped to my knees, shaking, coughing, tasting ash, and as I looked up at the cutting board, the remaining meat was crumbling, not spoiling, not melting, but turning into fine gray powder, like ash from a burned letter, the letters disintegrating first, as if the script was being erased from the world. And as the last lines collapsed, I heard one final tiny sound, not a laugh, not a groan, a soft click like a seal being stamped shut, and the kitchen fell silent in a way it had never been silent before, clean, empty, finished. And I sat there trembling until dawn leaked into the windows and the city began its ordinary day. And when staff arrived, they found me alone on the floor with a cold pot and a cutting board covered in gray ash that smelled faintly of incense. And I told them there had been a gas issue, a bad delivery, a late-night panic. And they believed me, because chefs are allowed to be strange. But the ending, like all true endings, was not complete comfort, because weeks later, when I was finally able to eat again without flinching, I noticed something in the mirror above my kitchen sink. Faint gray lines in the creases of my thumb, like soot that never fully washes away. And sometimes, when the pan is very hot and the oil first begins to shimmer, I hear it barely there. A tiny satisfied murmur under the sizzle, as if the curse is gone but the punishment's memory has nested inside my senses, reminding me that evil doesn't die. It changes form, and sometimes the last dish is served by someone who never asked to be an executioner. The clockwork execution, at 2:44 a.m. The only light in my flat came from my monitor, and the rain on the window sounded like someone testing keys on a dead piano. Slow and patient and slightly offbeat, the kind of sound that makes you feel watched even when you know you're alone. And I remember this not because the time itself matters, but because exhaustion creates a kind of religious attention to detail. Every minute becomes a nail you hang your sanity on. And that night I was trying to patch a broken build for a Kumbin simulation game nobody would remember in a year. The kind of corporate project with a cheerful art style and soft ambient music that pretends the world is harmless. And my name is Caleb Hargreaves, gameplay programmer, 32, London-based, chronically underslept. The kind of man who measures life in commits and coffee in the soft panic of deadlines, and I'd been staring at the same crash log for hours when I found the first line that made my stomach tighten. A function name that wasn't in our codebase, not in our repository history, not in any branch I'd ever pulled. A foreign little word sitting inside the stack trace like a fingerprint on clean glass. Execute. Loop. And the sight of it triggered the professional fear all developers know, the cold sweat of the impossible bug, because code doesn't simply appear. It comes from a commit, a merge, a dependency. Yet this function wasn't attached to any of those. It was there like a parasite. And when I clicked into the file path it referenced, my editor opened something that should not have existed. A folder inside our project directory named Clockwork that wasn't mapped to any asset pipeline, wasn't listed in build scripts, and yet contained several files with timestamps that didn't make sense, some dated years before the project even began. Others dated in the future, like the folder had been stitched into time incorrectly, and I told myself it was corrupted metadata, a server sync glitch, anything rational. But the deeper I went, the more rationality began to feel like an excuse rather than an explanation. Because the folder contained a single scene file, one cinematic sequence. No textures, no UI, no controls, just a loop. And the file name was written in plain, dry, contemptuous clarity. Execution. Scene. I should have closed it right there. I should have called IT, flagged a security audit, filed a report, walked away. But programmers have a compulsion that looks like courage from the outside and is actually just curiosity with teeth. So I loaded the scene in the engine preview, expecting an old test animation, some discarded prototype, maybe a placeholder for combat we'd cut from the design. And for a moment the screen stayed black, then the scene faded in, and I found myself staring at a stone chamber, rendered with such uncomfortable realism. It didn't match our game's art style at all. No stylization, no softness, only damp stone and iron bars and torchlight that breathed in slow orange pulses. And the audio that came with it was wrong too. Not our synthetic ambient track, but something recorded. Organic wet echoes. Distant dripping. The low animal hum of a crowd heard through thick walls. And in the center of the chamber, a man knelt with his wrists bound behind him, hair hanging loose, shoulders shaking with restrained effort. And even before the camera moved, I knew, instinctively, that this wasn't just a character. It was a person with weight, with history, with suffering stored in the posture of his back. And the camera drifted closer, the way a predator drifts, slow and inevitable. And the man lifted his head, and I recognized his face in the sick way. You recognize a portrait from a textbook, the narrow cheeks, the heavy-lidded eyes, the ruler's calm expression, even in defeat. And I thought, absurdly, that's Cow. And the absurdity made me laugh once under my breath, because why would an ancient warlord be in our simulation build? But the laughter died in my throat when the chamber door opened and figures stepped in wearing black robes with hoods that obscured their faces, moving with precise, rehearsed coordination like a ritual team. And one of them carried a device that looked like a cross between a clockwork mechanism and a torture wheel. Brass gears turning silently, needles clicking into place, and my skin went cold because the object wasn't designed by an artist for entertainment. It was designed with the intimate logic of function, like something meant to be used repeatedly, and the robed figure set it before the kneeling man, and the gears began rotating faster, and as they did, the chamber filled with a sound like distant machinery, like a factory that never stops, and the kneeling man's expression shifted from stoic contempt to something else. An almost involuntary flash of fear because he recognized the device, not as a prop, but as a sentence. And I found myself leaning closer to the monitor as if proximity could make it less unreal. And that was when a line of text appeared in the corner of the screen in a plain developer debug font. Simple white letters with no UI styling, like a system message from somewhere deeper than the game. Punishment must repeat until accounting is complete. Then the execution began. Not with gore, not with cinematic violence, but with rhythm. The clockwork device clicked, the robed figures moved in timed steps, and the punishment unfolded like a sequence that had been optimized, efficient, repeatable, designed for eternity. The kneeling man's body jerked as invisible force pinned him, his breath leaving in harsh, controlled bursts. And though the camera did not show explicit wounds, the sound design did something worse. It suggested suffering without granting you the relief of seeing it. Soft cracking noises, strained breath, the wet squeak of leather restraints tightening, the faintest, most humiliating whimper that escaped the man's throat like a secret he didn't want to admit existed. My hands were sweating on the mouse. I whispered, "What the hell is this?" to an empty flat. The scene lasted exactly 47 seconds. The gears slowed. The robed figures stepped back. The man slumped forward, trembling, and then, without fade out, without reset animation, the whole chamber snapped back to its initial state like a clock hand jumping torches rewound to their earlier flame shape. The kneeling man restored to the exact posture. The device returned to its starting angle. The same 47 seconds began again, and again, and again. At first, I told myself it was a looped cutscene. A weird one, sure, but a loop nonetheless. Yet each time it repeated, I noticed a detail that made my stomach twist tighter. The man's eyes. They weren't animated eyes. They tracked. They pleaded differently. The first time, contempt. The second time, dread. The third time, exhausted resignation. The fourth time, raw hatred. It was as if he remembered each cycle, as if the suffering was cumulative, even though the body reset, and that broke the last comforting boundary of, it's just code, because no ethical designer builds memory into a torture loop unless they want the pain to persist beyond the physical reset. I tried to stop the preview window, but the stop button didn't respond immediately, the program hanging for a half second too long, and in that half second I saw the debug text change, just a flicker, from a sentence into a single word, witness, and when the preview finally stopped, my IDE froze with it, cursor locked, fans in my PC spooling up like the machine was panicking, and I felt a pressure behind my ears the way you feel when you've been staring at a bright screen too long, except this pressure had intent, like someone had pressed 2 fingers to the sides of my skull to hold my attention in place. I restarted the engine. The folder was still there, the scene still loaded, the loop still played. I searched our repository for execute, loop, and found nothing. I checked package manifests, nothing. I ran malware scans, nothing. I wrote a script to print the folder tree. Clockwork did not appear in the output, yet my file explorer showed it plainly. The folder was both present and absent depending on how I asked the question, like it obeyed a different rule set than the operating system. My mouth went dry. My heart began that particular programmer's gallop, the one you feel when the bug is crossed from annoying into metaphysical. I messaged our team Slack, asking if anyone had heard of Clockwork or Execute, seen. Nobody replied for 20 minutes, because it was late. Then my lead answered with one line, "Stop messing with the punishment file." I stared at that message until my eyes hurt. I wrote back, "What punishment file?" He replied, "Don't. It's not ours." And then he went offline. That should have ended it. It should have scared me enough to stop. But fatigue and curiosity are a lethal pairing, and there's something in the human mind that cannot tolerate an injustice it can see clearly, even when it's fictional. I watched the loop again. 47 seconds. Reset. Again. The kneeling man's expression shifted from fear to emptiness in microscopic increments, like someone being sanded down by time. And I felt an unexpected anger rise in me, anger at whoever built this, anger at the cruelty of designing suffering to be infinite, anger at the idea of an afterlife run like a machine. I told myself it was a historical reenactment, a satire, a commentary. But the sound of the man's breath was too real to be satire. I could hear saliva. I could hear the tremor of a throat trying not to break, and the debug text remained in the corner like a judge's stamp. Punishment must repeat until accounting is complete. I thought of all the stories about hell being a bureaucracy, about the underworld having clerks and ledgers and laws. I thought of punishment as procedure, suffering as process. And I, idiot, arrogant programmer, looked at that loop and thought, I can fix this. So I opened the file. Not just in preview inside the code. The execute loop function wasn't written in any language I knew. It looked like code. Yes, indentation, brackets, and symbols, but the characters were slightly wrong. Like someone had taught a machine to mimic programming by watching it from behind a veil. There were strings embedded that looked like ancient Chinese mixed with something else, and variable names that resembled legal terms. Witness, ID, DEBT, count, sentence, duration, mercy. Flag always set to false. My breathing became shallow. I highlighted the function and hit delete. The text vanished. I saved. The editor did not ask for confirmation. There was no warning, just silence. I felt a wave of relief so strong it almost made me dizzy. Then I relaunched the engine preview. The chamber loaded. The kneeling man appeared. The robed figures stepped in. The clockwork device clicked into place, and in the corner, in that same plain white debug font, a new line appeared beneath the old one. Unauthorized mercy attempt detected. Sentence will be adjusted. The 47 seconds began, but this time it lasted 55. The camera angle changed slightly, just enough to reveal the man's wrists bound so tightly the skin around the rope had bruised dark. The gears in the device turned faster. The sound of cracking was louder, and the kneeling man looked directly at the camera for the first time, eyes wide, and his lips moved around. A sound I didn't hear, but understood anyway. The way you understand a scream through glass. Don't. The loop reset. Again. Again. And each time, the sentence adjusted. Each time, it became worse, as if my attempt to delete the code had not freed him, but proven the system needed to tighten its grip. And as I sat alone in my rain-lit flat watching a punishment machine learn how to protect itself, I realized the horrifying inversion of my own good intentions. I wasn't saving him. I was teaching the underworld how to hurt him more efficiently. After I saw the sentence adjust itself, after I watched those extra 8 seconds graft themselves onto the loop like a fresh cruelty patched into a living system, I did the most human thing possible. I tried to bargain with the machine by becoming more technical, because when reality feels supernatural, the programmer brain defaults to tooling, logs, diagnostics, anything that turns dread into data. And I told myself that if I could just isolate the loop, sandbox it, strip permissions to trace the origin of those files, I could cut the wire that fed the punishment. But the problem with a prison built like software is that it expects cleverness. It anticipates it. It turns intelligence into another trigger. So I started working with a kind of careful panic that felt like sleep paralysis in motion. Hands moving, mind screaming, and I wrote scripts to enumerate hidden directories. I ran checksum comparisons across the build. I diffed local against remote. I even unplugged my Ethernet because the idea of this thing being networked made my skin crawl. And for a few minutes that helped me breathe. Because without network access, the world felt smaller, controllable, until I realized the scene didn't care whether I was online. It wasn't asking permission from servers. It was executing like a ritual, like it had its own clock. And worse, the clockwork folder still existed even after I deleted it. Because when I searched again, the folder wasn't there in terminal output, but was still there in Explorer. Still there if I navigated by hand like a man walking through a house he knows is haunted, and the timestamp had changed to the current minute, as if it had just been touched. As if someone had reached into my machine and tapped the glass to prove they were awake, and that was the first moment I suspected what I'd been refusing to name. It wasn't a file. It was an interface, and the underworld had found a way to mount itself inside a development environment, the way a parasite mounts itself to a host's nervous system, using what was already there, my tools, my habits, my eyes to keep the punishment witnessed, because some systems don't run unless someone sees them. So I did what any developer does when the surface level lies. I went deeper. I attached a debugger, set breakpoints, tried to step through execution, seen as if it were our normal cinematic system. and the engine obeyed at first in a mocking way, loading assets, initializing lighting, spawning entities, until it reached the loop call. And then the debugger didn't just fail, it behaved like something had slapped my wrist. The call stack filled with nonsense, thread IDs multiplying rapidly like insects, and my machine's time desynced by a second clock jumping forward, then back like the loop was tugging on the system clock itself to make sure it stayed eternal, and the fans in my PC rose into a whine that sounded disturbingly like strained breathing. And under that whine I thought I heard the faintest groan human, exhausted, coming not from speakers but from the chassis, as if the hardware itself was being used as a throat, and I yanked my headphones off so fast my ears rang. Because you can tolerate horror on a monitor, but you can't tolerate it creeping into the physical world of desk and air and plastic. And that's when my phone buzzed again with a message from my lead, the same man who had warned me not to touch it. Except this time, it wasn't Slack. It was a text from an unknown number, and it contained nothing but a short string of characters. Witness. ID equals Hargreaves. C followed by a timestamp that matched the current second. And I felt my body go cold in a way caffeine can't touch because I had never written that format anywhere. Never shared my surname like that in our internal naming conventions. And the message wasn't a threat. It was a status readout, like a server responding to a query. And in that instant, the terrifying shape of the situation snapped into focus. The loop knew who I was, because the loop wasn't simply inside my project, it was inside my identity. And I reacted the way people react when they realize their name has been spoken in the dark by something that shouldn't know language. I checked my front door, checked the chain, checked the peephole, and the corridor outside was empty, dimly lit, ordinary, which somehow made it worse, because it meant the intruder didn't need a hallway. And when I sat back down at my desk, the monitor had already loaded the scene again without me clicking anything. Black screen fading into torchlight as if the system had decided my hands were optional now, and the debug font in the corner displayed a new line under the punishment statement, Witness, online, and then another line, Attention, lock, true, and I felt a subtle pressure behind my eyes, like someone tightening a strap around my skull. Not painful, just insistent, like a VR headset being cinched. And I realized I'd been sitting too still for too long, my body frozen in a posture of compliance, and I tried to stand, but my legs took a second to remember how, and in that lag I glimpsed the loop beginning again. Cao Cao kneeling, the robed figures entering, the clockwork device turning with that hateful efficiency, and I made a decision that, in retrospect, was as stupid as it was inevitable. If the system was reacting to deletion attempts by increasing punishment, then brute force was wrong, and the only way to help the prisoner would be to understand the rules well enough to exploit them. Because hell, if it existed as code, it would have conditions, it would have flags, it would have loopholes the way all bureaucracy has loopholes. And so I stopped trying to break the loop and started trying to read it, to profile it like malicious software. And I copied the entire clockwork directory to an external drive, telling myself physical separation might sever it. And the moment the copy completed, the external drive label changed on my desktop from untitled to evidence, and I stared at that word until my throat tightened, because my operating system didn't rename drives by itself, and I hadn't typed that. And then the scene flickered and the debug line updated again. Evidence moved. Sentence will be verified. And the word verified landed like a prison door slamming, because verification implies authority, and authority implies escalation. And when the loop restarted this time, the camera angle widened to reveal something I hadn't seen before. Beyond the chamber's iron bars was a corridor lined with countless doors, each door marked with faint symbols, and behind some doors there were silhouettes, moving in repetitive agony, other loops, other punishments, an infinite server rack of suffering. And as the camera drifted past those doors, I felt my stomach hollow out with cosmic nausea, because the scene wasn't a one-off punishment file. It was a viewport, a debug window into a whole infrastructure, and I suddenly understood why it looked more realistic than our game. It wasn't art, it was capture, a live feed from a place that didn't use imagination, and my hand shook as I paused the preview. But even paused, the sound of the clockwork device continued faintly, like a metronome refusing to stop. And that's when I noticed another file in the clockwork folder. One I hadn't seen before because it hadn't existed before. Witness. And inside it, a single JSON-like manifest with my name in it. My address, not exactly, but close enough to make my stomach turn. My IP, even unplugged. And 2 fields that made my mouth go dry. Eyes. Open equals true, and sleep. Allowed equals false. And I laughed once, sharp and ugly, because it was impossible, because it was ridiculous, because the underworld shouldn't have a settings panel for my insomnia. And yet my eyes felt hot and gritty like they'd been forced open for hours, and when I blinked too slowly, the pressure behind my eyes increased until my lids snapped up again, and the scene unpaused by itself. And Cao Cao looked straight at the camera again with that pleading hatred, and his lips shaped to say warning, don't, but behind him, behind the roped figures, a new figure stood that hadn't been there before. Taller, still, face unseen, robes darker than the rest, as if the light avoided him, and in his hands he held a ledger made of interlocking brass plates, like a clockwork book, gears ticking along the spine, and he turned one page with a mechanical click, and the debug text updated, cold as system output, witness interference recorded, counting, updated, and I felt the most humiliating, helpless realization of the night settle into my bones. I wasn't fighting the loop. I was feeding it. My attention was currency. My curiosity was the electrical current, and every time I tried to fix it, the system interpreted it as involvement, logging me deeper into the punishment's accounting like a witness who can't stop showing up to court. And the more I showed up, the more the sentence verified, evolving to include me as a component, and I thought of my lead's warning. Stop messing with the punishment file, and suddenly I understood why he'd gone offline so fast. Because maybe he'd already been a witness. Maybe he'd already learned the rule that the safest thing you can do around an underworld machine is to pretend you never saw it. And that thought made me do the one thing I hadn't tried yet, something neither technical nor brave. I begged. I leaned toward the screen, voice hoarse, and whispered into the torchlit chamber, as if it were a call. I'm sorry. Not sure whether I was apologizing to the prisoner or the system, and the next loop didn't adjust in duration. It adjusted in focus, the camera drifting away from Cao Cao's face and toward the bars, toward the corridor of doors, until the lens found a specific door marked with symbols that looked disturbingly like modern characters rendered in ancient style. And when it zoomed close enough, I read it with a jolt that made my stomach drop through the floor. Caleb Hargreaves, and beneath it in the same plain debug font, a line appeared like a status update for a new user. Cell reserved. I didn't sleep after the door labeled Caleb Hargreaves appeared on my screen. Not because I made a disciplined choice to stay awake, but because the manifest in divided by witness divided by had been right, sleep, allowed equals false, and I learned quickly that it wasn't a metaphor. It was a system policy, enforced through the most intimate hardware I own, my nervous system, because every time my eyelids drooped, the pressure behind my eyes tightened like a strap being pulled. Every time my head tilted forward, that same invisible grip corrected my posture with a sharp pulse of nausea. And I found myself sitting upright in my desk chair for hours, jaw clenched, blinking in a rapid, painful rhythm like a man trying to keep a fire alive with his breath. And in that forced wakefulness, the loop kept running, whether I watched it or not. Because even when I minimized the preview window, I could still hear the clockwork ticks faintly beneath my operating system sounds, hidden under notification pings and fan hum like a parasite's heartbeat. And the most humiliating realization arrived at 4:18 a.m., when I tried to look away, completely turning my chair toward the wall. Shutting my eyes, pressing my palms over my lids, and the chamber still appeared, not on the monitor this time, but behind my eyes, torchlight blooming in the dark of my skull, the kneeling figure's breath sinking to my own, the gears turning not in speakers but in bone conduction, and I understood then that the underworld didn't need my monitor anymore, because it had already bound the witness role to my attention, and attention is not a screen. It's a human function, and as long as I could perceive, I could be used. So I did what humans do when they feel cornered by an invisible authority. I sought another human being, another witness, as if social reality could override system reality. And at dawn, gray light, rain still tapping the window like patient nails, I walked to the office without showering, without eating, wearing the same hoodie and yesterday's smell of stale coffee and fear, and the city felt strangely distant, like I was seeing London through glass. Because every sound I heard in the street, bus brakes, crosswalk beeps, the rhythmic click of heels on pavement threaded itself into that same mechanical cadence as the clockwork device, making the whole world feel like it had adopted the loop's tempo. And when I arrived at our studio, the receptionist looked up with polite surprise and asked if I was all right. And I lied and said I was jet-lagged, because how do you explain that you've been drafted by a digital hell? And I went straight to my lead's desk. Graham found his workstation, dark chair tucked in, the kind of emptiness that makes an office feel suddenly too large, and I checked the team calendar for his status and saw he'd set himself to focus mode, indefinite, which would be funny in any other context, except it felt like a man locking his own door from the inside. And I walked into the kitchen area and cornered a colleague I trusted, a quiet systems engineer named Naomi, who had the calm eyes of someone who has survived corporate chaos. And I told her carefully, vaguely about the clockwork folder, about the execution loop, about the door with my name on it. And as I spoke, I watched her expression for disbelief, but something else happened instead. Her face drained of color as if I'd said a word she had been praying nobody would ever say aloud, and she whispered, "You opened it," like a diagnosis, and my stomach dropped because that meant she already knew. And when I demanded how, she glanced around the office as if checking for microphones, then pulled me into a small meeting room and shut the door. And in the quiet, she confessed that clockwork wasn't new. It had surfaced once before on an intern's machine months ago, an intern who had found a cutscene that wasn't ours, and when he tried to delete it, he ended up in the hospital with what doctors called stress-induced catatonia. Eyes open, body locked, like someone had set his pause state permanently, and the studio had quietly wiped his machine, signed NDAs, told everyone it was a mental health incident, and moved on, because companies are very good at treating supernatural emergencies as HR problems. And Naomi said Graham had been the one to oversee the cleanup. Graham had called it a corrupted build artifact. Graham had warned everyone never to touch the folder if they saw it, and Graham had deleted it from shared drives whenever it surfaced. But it always came back in the strangest places. Machines that had never pulled the affected branch, laptops that were offline, devices that didn't even have the engine installed, which made the only possible conclusion unbearable. Clockwork wasn't a file. It was an infection of attention, a thing that crawled along curiosity the way malware crawls along links, and Naomi told me something that made my mouth go dry. Graham didn't go offline last night because he was busy. He went offline because he recognized the stage of the process I was in, the stage where the system assigns the witness a cell, and once a cell is reserved, the system begins sinking, and the longer it sinks, the harder it is to detach. Then I asked what sinking meant, and Naomi answered with a trembling half-laugh. It starts mapping you, and in that moment my throat constricted because I remembered the manifest fields. Eyes, open, sleep, aloud, and realized those weren't passive data points, they were control points. So I ran back to my desk at the office and opened my laptop, hoping that maybe a different machine in a different building would break the loop's hold. But the moment the desktop loaded, a window appeared on its own, with a simple message in that same plain debug font, "Witness relocated. Stream continues." And then the screen filled with the corridor of doors again. Not the execution chamber at first, but the hallway where punishments lived in storage, like files, and I watched in horror as the camera drifted past doors, labeled with names I didn't recognize, some in languages I couldn't read yet, somehow understood as human. And behind each door a different loop repeated hands, endlessly typing apology letters, lungs forever filling with water, bodies falling and standing and falling again, until the camera arrived at my door, Caleb Hargreaves, and lingered long enough for my skin to break into cold sweat. Then, like a tutorial text appeared. Cell conditions, custom, and beneath it, sentence type, witness, and I realized with disgust that I wasn't being punished for a crime at all. I was being sentenced to watch, to be the power source of someone else's suffering. because in a system like this, witnesses are infrastructure, and I tried to shut the laptop, but it wouldn't close. Not physically stuck, but my hands froze on the lid as if a silent command had been issued to my muscles. Hold, and Naomi grabbed my wrist and yanked my hand away, breaking whatever spell had locked it, and in that sudden jerk, I felt the pressure behind my eyes release just enough for me to gasp, and Naomi hissed, "Don't fight it directly." And I demanded how else I could fight, and she said there was only one known method Graham had ever succeeded with, transferring the role, because the system didn't care who watched, as long as the watching continued. And that sentence hit me like poison because it meant the only escape was to ruin someone else, to pass the cell reservation like an unwanted inheritance. And Naomi didn't say it with cruelty. She said it with exhausted honesty, the kind of honesty people develop when they've seen too many disasters managed through sacrifice. And I refused at first, because I'm not a monster. I'm a programmer with insomnia, and a mortgage, and a conscience. But refusal is a luxury when the door with your name on it is already built. And as we argued, the office lights flickered once, only once, and every monitor in the open floor plan glitched simultaneously. Not crashing, just flashing the same corridor image for a fraction of a second, like a subliminal broadcast. And I heard very faintly dozens of coworkers inhale sharply at once, as if they'd all seen something they couldn't explain. And I realized with cold dread that the system wasn't only mapping me, it was scanning for replacement witnesses, sampling attention like a predator sampling blood in water. And my guilt twisted because my presence in that office was now a risk to everyone in it. And I literally ran out of the building into the wet morning air with Naomi chasing, shouting my name, telling me to stop. But my body moved on raw survival instinct. And as I ran down the street, the ticking sound followed. Hidden under traffic, under rain, under my own pounding heart, and I understood then that my cell wasn't a physical room underground. It was a state of perception, a filter that turned reality into a corridor of punishments. And the most horrifying part was how normal it still looked. Pedestrians with umbrellas, delivery vans, cafes opening, life continuing, while behind it all I could sense the infinite machine turning, waiting for my attention to lock in again. And when I finally reached my flat and slammed the door, panting, I looked at my monitor, which I'd left off, and saw it was already on, already displaying the execution chamber. Cao Cao kneeling, robed figures entering, and in the corner, the debug text had changed, less like a warning now, more like a verdict. Cell initialization, 89%, and beneath that, almost casually, breath pattern matched, and the moment I read those words, my lungs seized in sudden compression. Not enough to kill, just enough to terrify, as if the system had tested my body the way you test a microphone, confirming that my breathing could be used as timing, and in the execution chamber, the clockwork device began turning in perfect sync with my own strained inhale and exhale, like my breath had become the metronome that kept the torture running. And in that synchronization, I felt the final horror settle into place. The cell didn't need walls. It only needed my lungs. Because as long as I kept breathing, the sentence could keep repeating. I tried to hold my breath to prove the machine wrong. A childish reflex. The same defiance you feel when you think a nightmare can be beaten by refusing to participate. But the moment I stopped breathing, the pressure on my ribs tightened with calm authority, not panicked. Not angry administrative, like a system enforcing policy. And my lungs screamed for air. And when I finally gasped, the clockwork device in the chamber surged forward in perfect rhythm with my inhale as if rewarded, as if my suffocation had simply trained it to anticipate me better. And I understood then the hideous elegance of the sentence type. Doesn't end when you repent or die. It ends only when you become reliable infrastructure. When your body's involuntary functions, breath, blink, heartbeat, are harvested as timing signals for suffering that is not yours. And once that thought landed, my mind began splintering into strategies the way it always does under stress. Not heroic plans, but desperate engineering. What if I sedate myself? What if I blindfold myself? What if I destroy the monitor? What if I move to a hotel, What if I smashed the laptop and burned the drive and ripped the router out of the wall? And I tried several of those, like a man throwing tools at a locked door, because I yanked the power cable from my PC and the monitor went black for half a second, then lit back up anyway. From battery backup I didn't own, showing torchlight again like a stubborn eye reopening, and I hurled the monitor onto the floor and the glass spiderwebbed, the image distorting. Yet within the broken pixels the chamber still moved, still looped, the execution continuing, as if the feed could survive any surface. And when I grabbed the external drive with the copied clockwork folder and ran it under my kitchen tap, water pouring over plastic like baptism, the drive light continued, blinking calmly through the stream. And on my phone, my personal phone, not connected to the build, an alert appeared. Evidence damaged. Accounting will continue. And my stomach dropped because it meant every act I took was being logged and interpreted. Not as resistance, but as participation, as if the underworld were a ticketing system and I was just opening more support requests. And when I tried to leave my flat, when I grabbed keys and coat and stepped into the corridor, the hallway lights flickered, and for a fraction of a second the walls looked wrong, too damp, too old, stone instead of plaster, and I smelled torch smoke where there should have been disinfectant. And the sense of distance collapsed so sharply I staggered, because I realized the corridor outside my flat wasn't simply a corridor anymore. It was beginning to overlay with the corridor of doors behind the iron bars in the execution scene, like the system was mapping the prison architecture onto my physical space, aligning realities the way AR aligns digital objects to real surfaces. And my own front door suddenly looked like a cell door, and the peephole looked like an eye. And I slammed myself back inside, shaking, because the underworld didn't need to transport me anywhere. It only needed to change what my senses believed. And that was the moment Naomi's earlier words. It starts mapping, you became unbearable truth, because mapping is how systems make worlds navigable, and something was making my world navigable for itself, and that realization forced me into the ugliest kind of clarity. This wasn't a haunting, it was a deployment. The execution loop was an application of punishment running on my brain as host hardware, and if I wanted out, I had to treat it like software that could be exploited, not destroyed. Because deletion only escalated, direct resistance only tightened the sentence, so I sat on the floor among broken monitor shards and forced myself into the calmest mindset I could manage, the mindset of a man debugging a catastrophic production issue at 3 a.m., and I reopened the clockwork files. Not in the engine now, but raw, like reading malware source. And I found the section I'd missed earlier because I'd been too horrified to look closely. The underworld loop wasn't written to prevent deletion. It was written to respond to interference as tampering. And in that response were two key branches, two pathways that made my throat tighten. One branch was sentence, adjust, which I'd already triggered by deleting lines. The other was witness, reassign, a function that had looked irrelevant at first, buried like an emergency exit, and under it were conditions what amounted to an authentication mechanism, something about voluntary attention transfer. And it hit me like a cold slap. The system could allow witness reassignment, but only if the current witness offered someone else intentionally, because hell, like any bureaucracy, prefers consent to force. Consent is cleaner. Consent writes better in the ledger. And the moment I realized that, my skin crawled with the moral trap, because it meant the only official escape route was betrayal. The exact crime Cao Cao was being punished for in the first place, abuse of power, manipulation, cruelty packaged as policy, and I understood the final cruelty of the prison. It turns witnesses into traitors. It makes you reenact the sin to earn relief. And in that understanding I felt sick, because I could see the shape of my future, like a hallway of doors. Either I sacrifice someone and walk free, or I refuse and become infrastructure forever, a cell with my name on it. Breath pattern matched, attention locked, and as that choice pressed down on me, the execution loop on my broken monitor changed again, as if reading my thoughts. Because for the first time, the robed figures paused mid-ritual and looked outward toward the camera, toward me, and one of them lifted a hand, not in threat, but in invitation, palm up, fingers slightly curled like a clerk requesting a signature, And in the corner, the debug text updated with bureaucratic politeness. Witness reassignment available. Provide new ID. And beneath that, like a blinking cursor waiting for input, a single symbol pulsed, and my mouth went dry, because in that symbol I recognized what the system truly wanted, a name, and I tried to tell myself I wouldn't do it. I tried to anchor my ethics to something human. Naomi's pale face, the intern in Catatonia, all the coworkers whose monitors had flickered with the corridor image for a split second, innocent people who didn't deserve a cell reservation, but then the pressure on my ribs returned, harder this time, and my vision narrowed until the room tunneled, and I realized the system didn't need to argue morality with me. It only needed to apply discomfort until my body begged my mind to cooperate, because pain is the underworld's user interface. And as I wheezed, as my lungs fought, I heard in the execution chamber a new sound added beneath the clockwork. My own ragged breathing sampled and looped back at me, turned into ambience, turned into soundtrack, like the system was demonstrating its ownership, and I felt panic escalate into something more dangerous, resentment, because once something owns your breath, you start wanting revenge. You start wanting any exit, even if it stains someone else, and that is how prisons turn good intentions into betrayal. And in that black moment of desperation, my fingers hovered over the blinking cursor in the code as if about to type a colleague's name. And the horror was not that the underworld offered me this choice. The horror was that part of me, tiny, ashamed, very human, wanted to take it, wanted to patch the curse by handing it fresh eyes. And as that temptation swelled, the chamber on the screen widened again, showing the corridor of doors stretching infinitely, and my own door at the end stood open now, torchlight spilling out, ready, waiting, like a hotel room prepared for a guest. And I understood with cosmic coldness that the punishment wasn't only for Cow. It was for anyone who thinks suffering can be debugged without cost. Because every time you patch a system like this, you don't make it kinder, you make it hungrier. I wish I could tell you I resisted the cursor, that I closed the laptop and chose righteousness and paid whatever price hell demanded with my own lungs. But honesty is the only clean thing left in a story like this. So I'll tell you what really happened. I hovered over the witness, reassign input for a long time while the system squeezed my ribs in polite increments. And for those minutes, my mind became a courtroom where every argument was losing, because every ethical principle I had ever held felt like a luxury compared to the raw animal desire for breath. And the cursor blinked like a tiny heartbeat waiting for a name. And the underworld's chamber waited too, the robed clerk still. Cao kneeling, the clockwork device turning at idle speed, as if ready to surge. And in that awful pause, I realized the system's true design wasn't to punish a single historical villain. It was to build a chain, an infinite supply line of witnesses who keep the viewport open, because pain may be eternal, but it still needs an audience. And that meant the coolest part of the execution loop wasn't the torture itself. It was that it had been engineered to recruit, to make every compassionate person who tries to intervene become an accessory. Because compassion makes you stare longer. Compassion makes you lean in. Compassion is how the prison finds fresh eyes. And when I saw that, something inside me finally snapped. Not into heroism, but into disgust at the mechanism, the machine logic of suffering, as content. And that disgust did something my fear had failed to do. It loosened my attachment to the idea of fixing him, because I understood that every attempt to help Cao had only deepened the system's hold. Not because the prisoner deserved pain, but because the prison was built to weaponize rescue, and the only act it could not digest cleanly was refusal. Not deletion, not smashing hardware, not transferring the role, but the simple, impossible refusal to look, the refusal to provide attention at all, because attention was its power supply. So I stopped bargaining and started planning like a man trying to starve a parasite. And the plan I came up with was grotesque in its simplicity. I would remove my own access to sight, permanently if necessary, at least for long enough to break the witness log before the system could complete cell initialization. And the moment I formed that intention, the pressure on my ribs spiked in warning, as if the underworld recognized a threat it couldn't patch with bureaucracy, and the debug text in the corner changed from polite to urgent. Witness instability detected, and I felt panic flutter in my throat, because it meant the system might tighten, might crush, might force compliance by breaking my body, Yet there is a strange strength that arrives when you decide on self-harm for a purpose. Not because it is noble, but because desperation sharpens into clarity. So I crawled to my bathroom cabinet with shaking hands, ignoring the chamber's ticking tempo and Cao Cao's ragged breath syncing with mine. And I grabbed the strongest sedatives I had from an old prescription, pills I'd kept for long flights and never used. And I also grabbed a roll of thick black electrical tape and a scarf, because I didn't trust a blindfold I could easily rip off when the machine tightened its grip. And I worked fast like a man in a burning building, swallowing the pills with tap water that tasted like metal, then wrapping the scarf over my eyes so tightly it hurt, then sealing the edges with tape until light disappeared completely, until the world became pure darkness and my breathing sounded unbearably loud inside cloth. And the instant I did it, the pressure behind my eyes flared. Not pain exactly, more like an angry static as if the system was shouting silently. And I heard the debug font voice in my skull now, flat and administrative. Eyes open required. And I laughed once, a wet, broken laugh into the scarf, because for the first time I had done something it could not solve with an update. And then the punishment loop tried to lure me back, because without sight the sound became sharper. The clockwork device clicked like teeth. Cao Cao's breath came through in humiliating detail, and beneath it I heard something else. The soft whimper of other cells down the corridor, an entire server of suffering whispering for witnesses, and the temptation to tear the scarf off surged like an itch, because humans can endure pain more easily than uncertainty, and darkness is uncertainty. But the sedatives began blooming through my bloodstream like cold ink, and my limbs grew heavy, and the system responded by tightening my ribs again to keep me awake, to keep attention alive. And I fought it by doing the only thing sedatives do well. I surrendered consciousness. I let myself slide. I let my thoughts blur. I let sleep, illegal sleep, wash over me in thick waves. And as I slipped, I felt the corridor map overlay again, this time not in sight but in space, as if the hallway of doors existed behind my eyelids, and I sensed my own door opening wider, torchlight spilling toward me, the cell reserved, ready to initialize. But then something changed, something I didn't anticipate, because as my consciousness thinned, the execution chamber's sound began to drift farther away, like a radio station losing signal, the clockwork ticks becoming faint. And with each fading tick, the pressure on my ribs eased a fraction. And in that easing, I understood the secret rule the underworld didn't want witnesses to learn. Its prison runs on wakeful attention, not mere existence. And if you can truly stop perceiving, stop feeding it, eyes, mind, interpretation, it begins to starve. So I leaned into that starvation, with everything I had left, letting the sedatives drag me down, refusing to grab onto any thought, any image, any curiosity. And the last thing I heard before I crossed into unconsciousness was Cao Cao's voice, not the groaning of punishment, but a single hoarse whisper that sounded almost human, almost grateful. Don't look. And then darkness swallowed me like water. When I woke, it was afternoon. Sunlight was leaking under the taped scarf in thin, warm lines, and the first sensation I felt was ordinary hunger, which almost made me cry because hunger is life. Hunger is normal. And my ribs ached, but not with compression, more with the soreness of muscles after panic. And when I peeled the tape off slowly, blinking at daylight, the room looked like my room again. Broken monitor shards on the floor, cables tangled, coffee mug overturned, mundane disaster, human disaster, and the ticking sound was gone. My phone had 17 missed calls from Naomi, and one message that chilled my blood even in relief. Don't open any screens. They're looking for you. And the moment I read that, I understood the ending wasn't neat, because starving a system doesn't always destroy it. Sometimes it only makes it roam. And when I cautiously opened my laptop, yes, I know, stupid again, but I needed to confirm I didn't see the chamber. I saw only a plain black screen with white debug font text, centered like a death notice. Witness offline. Cell initialization halted. And beneath it, new witness, search in progress. And then one final line that made the warmth drain from my body. Do not intervene. because that line wasn't a warning anymore. It was a command from a bureaucracy that doesn't care whether you live, only whether the punishment continues. And I realized with slow dread that I hadn't freed Cao Cao. Not truly. I'd only stepped out of the witness seat, leaving the loop hungry for replacement, and somewhere in London, someone would notice a strange folder, a scene that doesn't match the art style, a debug line in white font, and their compassion would do what mine did, lean in, watch, try to help, and the corridor would reserve another door with their name on it, and the execution would continue. And as I sat there in late afternoon light with my eyes still sore from tape and my ribs still aching from the machine's polite pressure, I understood the most haunting truth of digital hell. The cruelty isn't that time is infinite. It's that someone will always be awake to watch it. Tonight. If you've been listening with the lights low, if you've been letting the stories seep into the soft parts of your mind the way rain seeps into old brick, then you already know what I'm about to say. Horror doesn't always arrive with claws. It doesn't always burst from the dark in a dramatic rush. Sometimes it comes politely. Sometimes it wears a uniform. Sometimes it hides inside a pattern, inside a routine, inside a rule you follow without thinking. A man in Chinatown believes he's being guided by a bleeding spirit at 3:15 a.m., only to discover the dead aren't always the cleverest liars. The living are. The surgeon saves his child and thinks he's won a bargain with the beyond until he realizes time itself is collecting him in pieces, year by year, like a patient creditor with no face. A young artist paints over his birthmark, desperate to rewrite his own reflection, and the ink answers back, turning skin into confession, destiny into mask. A grieving widow calls out for her husband and gets a stranger instead, because sometimes the worst fear isn't being haunted, it's being claimed. A collector buys beauty and calls it ownership, not noticing that beauty is often the gentlest bait in the oldest trap, and that a deity kept behind glass doesn't need worship, it only needs a name to write. A chef in London tries to cook excellence into a plate and finds the ingredient screaming because evil doesn't always die. Sometimes it gets repackaged, redistributed, fed back to the world again and again. And finally, a programmer sees a loop that shouldn't exist, tries to do the right thing, and learns the cruelest rule of all. In the underworld, mercy can be treated like interference, and interference makes the sentence worse. 7 stories, 7 different doors, yet the same hand on the latch, the same idea, whispering beneath every scene. That punishment doesn't always look like punishment. Sometimes it looks like success, like talent, like love, like justice, like curiosity. And if you're lying there now, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince your thoughts to quiet down, let me leave you with something gentle, not comforting, just true in a way that feels like cold glass against your palm. You can lock your windows, you can turn on the hallway light, you can check under the bed like you did when you were a child. But the things we talked about tonight, they don't crawl in from outside. They arrive through what you allow, through what you touch, through what you keep, through what you watch too long. So if you wake at 3:15 a.m. and feel the urge to check the camera feed, if you smell incense where there shouldn't be any, if you notice an odd folder on your desktop that you swear you didn't create, do yourself a favor. Don't argue with it. Don't fix it. Don't even try to understand it. Because there are machines in this world that run on attention, and if you feed them with your eyes, they learn your name. This has been your midnight broadcast, your quiet companion for the sleepless hours. If you're still awake, breathe slow. Let the darkness be just darkness. And if sleep comes, let it come without you looking back. Good night.